There's a lot of factions out there in Warhammer 40k, from noble space marines and brave human soldiers fighting for a decaying Imperium, foul chaos zealots scheming to acquire power and advance the aims of their thirsting gods, and Xenos empires of aliens rising up and ever expanding their borders, often wielding unknowable technology or strange magics against an unsuspecting galaxy. With all that going on, it can be a rather daunting task to pick a faction out there in Warhammer 40k. At the moment, there's a good 28 or so major ones that you could collect if you wanted to, and potentially a fair few more if you count certain subcategories. General advice for picking an army usually tends to go with the one that you vibe with the best, essentially playing the army that you like the lore, look and feel of, as getting an army from grey plastic sprues to on the tabletop can be a big task and an expensive one at that, and you don't really want to invest all that in an army that you don't really enjoy quite so much. Having said that though, that doesn't necessarily help narrow things down, and there's lots of specific areas that might affect you one way or the other to go for one faction or the next. The look and feel of the miniatures on the tabletop, what the army does in the lore and background, and the reason for taking the fight to the rest of the galaxy. The rules and game mechanics certainly can be a draw, particularly if you think their way of fighting on the tabletop is particularly fun, and you like their playstyle, whether it's being all very subtle and clever, or big, tough and fighty. These can change and warp over time from edition to edition though. The army's in-game power versus the rest of the factions can often be a draw for many, though it's usually not considered to be a good idea to get into an army for that alone. This will definitely change as Games Workshop rebalances things and releases new rules. And then there's the practical considerations as well. Some armies are way cheaper to collect than others, and some might not take as much time or effort to get on the tabletop, perhaps having a lower model requirement and are easier to paint up than others. If you want to experiment, you can always just try out a few models, perhaps pick up the codex or watch a bunch of lore videos online or something about your army you're eyeing up, maybe get a box of the basic troops and paint up a few, and then make the decision as to whether or not you want to expand to an army in general. In Warhammer 40k, the factions broadly belong to three major allegiances: the Imperial armies that fight for the God Emperor of mankind, permanently interred on his golden throne and holy terror; the force of chaos, perhaps primarily fighting against the Imperium and furthering the aims of their vile deities, always seeking to corrupt and expand their influence; and then the alien Xenos species, aliens of many different flavours, whether it's the last might of the dying race of the Aeldari, the savage greenskins and their great war crusades and migrations, or the all-consuming Tyranids from beyond the galaxy seeking to devour all life. Within those categories fight many different armies. For the Imperium, a massive chunk of their armies are the Space Marine chapters, the more centralised ones that follow the teachings of the Codex Astartes, 6 of the first founding ones typically getting the limelight there, 5 more divergent chapters, with the Dark Angels, Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Black Templars and Deathwatch. They have more of their own unique fighting styles, and then the Demon Hunting Grey Knights that stand apart from the rest. Beyond the Space Marines, there's all manner of other arms of the Imperial Authority though: the Adepta Sororitas, nuns with guns that fight for the Imperial faith; the creepy tech support and master of the Forge Worlds, the Adeptus Mechanicus; the Hammer of the Emperor, the Astra Miltiarum, Imperium's primary military branch, representing regular humans drafted to fight; the superior Emperor's own legion of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's bodyguards, the towering war engines of the Imperial Knights, and the Agents of the Imperium, representing some specialised assets, with the Inquisition, assassin, rogue traders and more. For the Force of Chaos, Space Marines make up the vast majority there. There's the core Codex Chaos Space Marines, which also encompasses a fair few mortal followers as well, though the main bulk of their force are made up of the traitor legions that turned against the Emperor. Then there's the 4 armies that represent the deity Chaos Legions, the Death Guard Thousand Sons, World Eaters and Emperor's Children, who all basically worship one of the 4 main Chaos deities and exemplify their way of war. There's the Chaos Demons, representing the direct influence and servants of the gods themselves, and then the Chaos Knights, basically the traitor version of the Imperial ones, Twisted Fallen Dread Nobles. Then finally we have the Xenos, the space elf Aeldari, using all of their psychic might and technology to ward off their own extinction, and they have several sub-armies within them, including the Harlequins, Ynnari and Corsairs. There's their twisted dark kin, who are the Drukhari, fallen Eldar that feast and feed off the pain of mortals, the all-consuming force of the Tyranids to devour all before them, with their Genestealer Cult allies to infect the Imperium from within, the young upstart Tau Empire fighting for their greater good alongside auxiliaries such as their Kroot, the ruthless and prospect-driven leagues of Votann, cloned space dwarves expanding their prospects from the centre of the galaxy, the barbaric Orks making war for the sheer joy of it and stomping the galaxy flat with looted technology, and the deathless Necrons arising from their tomb worlds to reclaim their realm. As you can tell from the perspective of a newer player, it's a pretty dizzying choice, so for this one we'll do a broad overview of each Warhammer 40k faction, talk about their lore and place in the galaxy and how they like to fight, look at their miniature range with a whole bunch of examples of models that you can collect for them, roughly how much they might cost compared with other factions, and then talk about how they take to the tabletop on the field of battle, with any interesting game mechanics and how they often get things done at the moment. Absolutely loads to talk about, so let's jump in with the Space Marines. We'll start out with the Imperium and then go through Chaos and Xenos forces. The Space Marines are of course the single best known army in the Warhammer 40k setting, pretty much the poster boys of 40k in general. They're humans, but humans who are heavily augmented, selected from an early age and put through a brutal regimen of training. Their organs replaced and augmented in many different ways, and then equipped with some of the finest arms and war gear that the Imperium can manufacture, ceramite power armor, mighty bolters that fire explosive shells, and they operate in roughly 1,000 strong chapters presided over by a chapter master, mostly adhering to the teachings of Guilliman's Codex Astartes. Most of these tend to have a sort of overall feel of a sort of monastic warrior monk sort of profile, maybe like various knightly orders from the past, though for each chapter this is combined with their own quirks, heraldry and flaws, and the way that Space Marine armies fight can be very different indeed. They make war with a vast array of tactics and war gear, maybe bolters, chainswords and power weapons often being mainstays for a lot of chapters. They fight well at range and melee. They'll usually tend to have the heroes and their bodyguards at the forefront of the action, leading by example, and tend to hit hard and strike fast with fast-moving assault tactics, perhaps mobile fire bases, laying down heavy fire support, arrow-swift bite formations, or deploying with a tactical mix of all options that can overcome any challenge. Chapter identity is a pretty huge part of the Space Marines, and as mentioned there's certain chapters that get supported in excess of some of the rest. The first founding chapters pictured here are the ones that Games Workshop tend to support the most, with a little model and rule support that you can absolutely make your own with their own heraldry, and maybe count them as successors of some of the first founding ones here. The Space Marine miniature range is just about the biggest and best supported in all of Warhammer 40k. There's loads of Space Marine players, at least partly due to the various different ways that you can collect Space Marines, so Games Workshop has just continually updated, improved and changed their range around, and that tends to mean that there's yet more Space Marine players attracted to the faction. In particular, over the last 8 years or so, Games Workshop have gradually been refreshing the entire Space Marine range with their Primaris project, most of the range going to a slightly bigger scale than the previous ones, and at the moment the vast majority of the range is sort of at a new scaling, though there's still a good remnant of the firstborn Space Marines that came before them. I'd consider all of those on borrowed time at the moment, and there's a very good chance that lots of them get taken away at the start of next edition, maybe replaced by yet more new stuff. Standard Space Marine kits tend to have a sort of fairly plain and unadorned version of power armor. You can see their base troop on the left with the intercessors. There's an all very tactical incursor as an infiltration style troop despite some bright heraldry still, and a bike mounted outrider armed with a chainsword here. Their power armor is kind of deliberately unadorned and not particularly fancy, meaning that there's really quite a good scope to customize them to various different themes. The heavier support and vehicles, the Primaris have quite a lot of their hover tanks, which maybe divide opinions a bit more. There's the Impulsor at the back there. Their dreadnoughts are rather iconic, walking sarcophagi housing an injured battle brother, serving with the might of a walking battle tank with duty eternal, and Space Marine forces might deploy from the upper atmosphere by drop pod, screaming down onto a planet's surface before the pod springing open and disgorging the Space Marines into combat. Their character and command range is interesting enough as well. Chaplains are creepy skull-masked morale officers keeping the faith within the army. Librarians are the psychers and sanctioned warp users within the chapter, scrying out the future or employing battle magic or thwarting their peers in other factions. And Tech Marines have their training on Mars and are responsible for the chapter's armory and keeping it functioning and firing effectively in battle. Here are just a few of people's favourite Space Marine miniatures. These and maybe the Blade Guard veterans, and the new sculpts of the Terminators went down particularly well in 10th edition on the top right there. Big exo-armoured chapter elites often deploying by teleport strike. That's only scratching the surface of their enormous range. They do have a vast amount of options that you can choose and all sorts of different war gear. Price-wise, Space Marines tend to be one of the very cheapest armies that you can collect out there, though maybe a bit more so if you're willing to be a bit flexible with which miniatures you pick up and sort of go with the flow with their discount deals. They almost always tend to have some of the best discount deals on offer and often quite a lot of different choice as well. They can make good use of plenty of the Divergent chapter combat patrol discount boxes, and also the starter set for each edition tends to be a particularly good deal. While that is true though, they're also an army that you could spend basically unlimited amounts on if you wanted to and just kept on buying stuff to paint up. They're an army where if you wanted to paint up every single new release for them, then you'd be pretty much constantly buying stuff, and Games Workshop will certainly keep it coming. All that being said though, if you're fairly flexible, they're certainly one of the cheapest armies in the game to get on the table with a fully effective force. For gameplay, the rules are in Codex Space Marines from the start of 10th edition. The Divergent chapters like Dark Angels and Blood Angels and Friends do their own thing with a supplement book to add in their own unique and fancy units. With so much choice, they can do a whole bunch of range and melee builds, anything from tank columns to squadrons of dreadnoughts, heavy focus on melee elites, or more subtle sneaky things with some Phobos Marines and lone operatives. In general though, their army tends to be at least relatively forgiving, hitting quite hard, even your basic troopers having a bit of melee profiles to be able to bully some lighter infantry out there. and most units capable of being at least relatively sturdy, with a 3+ armor save and access to Armor of Contempt to worsen the AP of enemy guns. Their core rule is the Oath of Moment, allowing you to basically just target one enemy unit and then reroll all hit rolls against it and +1 to wounds, which is just a spectacular damage buff to bring down one thing. I will mention current power for each of these armies, though bear in mind it often changes. Space Marines in particular tend to be an army where just any one random collection of models is unlikely to be all that strong most of the time, but a completely honed and optimized build can be very scary. Currently the meta of the day is to take a whole bunch of Victrix Honor Guard with the Ultramarines, maybe with Calgar or Guilliman thrown in. They can be all very intimidating on the tabletop. They've got a huge amount of different playstyles and lots of other stuff can work. Maybe some Salamanders with some hard-hitting Melter Fire is another strong one, and Raven Guard Shadowmark Talon's still interesting in spite of some points nerfs recently. I wouldn't get too hung up about competitive builds if you're playing at a more casual level. Talking of Ultramarines and Salamanders and chapters though, as mentioned, Games Workshop supports the 6 first founding chapters with some of their own unique choices and flavour. Most of them get some unique flavourful models with 2 named characters and upgrade sprue, and a varied detachment that they can use, and these are perhaps the particularly storied chapters in Warhammer 40k lore, as they're the ones that are directly descended from the Emperor's original legions during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. If there's one flavour of Space Marines that are the poster boys of 40k, then it's the Ultramarines, and as a result, particularly with additions recently, they're by far the best supported models-wise. Loads of different characters, including their Primarch Rabute Guilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium right now, and also unusual in having their own elite force in the Victrix Honor Guard. None of the other more Codex chapters get a unique unit outside of characters yet besides them. They fight in their iconic blue power armour, and their theming is all a bit Romanesque, presiding over a very civilized realm of Ultramar in the galactic southeast. As the Sons of Guilliman, they tend to be very focused on the tactical doctrines exemplified by the Codex Astartes, and usually feel balanced forces of Space Marines to overcome any challenge. In-game, as mentioned, they're probably the strongest Space Marine chapter right now, and many of their characters are very interesting indeed. Victrix Honor Guard have enormous stats and access to some great movement rules, and Rabute Guilliman is a game-changing model if you choose to include him, doubling down on Oath of Moment and handing out free stratagems and command points to things nearby. Their themed detachment is the Gladius Task Force, which again is one of the strong ones. Their combat doctrines giving them different layers of being able to move fast and hit things, and also some stratagems that can support melee rather well. They've definitely got some advantages both model and gameplay wise versus the rest. Next up we have the White Scars, a very fast moving chapter in the Sons of Jagatai Khan. They have a Space Mongol style theme going on, and perhaps the most traditional way of being fielded is to have a whole load of bikers representing cavalry charges of old. They've got a couple of unique characters with Korsaro Khan with his nice bird here, and the jet bike mounted Sabodan Khan. In game, both their characters are usable enough. Korsaro Khan may be a little bit whatever, but is very cheap. Sabodan Khan and a squad of Outriders can move really fast and hit pretty hard, and their themed detachment is the Stormlance Task Force, letting everything advance and charge, and has some nice support for mounted things in particular. They can potentially make mounted units and flying vehicles really quite tough with a -1 to hit and wound, amongst other things. The detachment maybe is just a bit awkward one for them. They really enjoy having some heavier hitting bikes that hit hard in melee, and as a result, their detachment often gets nixed by other choices, perhaps particularly Dark Angels Raven Wing and Space Wolf Thunderwolves. For the Raven Guard, they're a stealthy, sneaky, and tactically aware chapter, fighting in their black armour. They like to use a lot of infiltration marines, so you'll probably see lots of ones deployed in Phobos armour, and also jump packs are a big deal for them, striking from the shadows on wings of fire. And they enjoy using lightning claws, where both their characters basically have that configuration, with Kayvon Shrike and Ethon Shan. Both those characters are pretty good and have some good lone operative shenanigans. They're hard to shoot down at long range, and their unique detachment is the Shadowmark Talon, basically a boosted version of the Vanguard Task Force with some really nice advantages, helping support some ranged firepower and with lots of return to reserve shenanigans that can get heavy guns shooting where they need to. Lists of this often tend to go heavier on Inceptors and Centurions, plus some jump pack troops for Shrike to lead. It was a bit more standout until quite recently though, where it had a few points and rules changes for the worse. The Iron Hands believe the flesh is weak, to the extent where they replace their superhuman Space Marine parts with bionics and make war with calculated efficiency, often using a lot of heavy firepower to get the job done before moving in to dispatch the foe with ruthless efficiency. They've got 2 character models with Ironfather Phyros, a sort of high-tech Marine com chaplain, and Karnok Var, the master of their first company, Clan of Ynnari. The heavy firepower is often dispensed by a great number of vehicles and dreadnoughts striding into battle and shrugging off all enemy firepower. And the themed detachment within Codex Space Marines is the Ironstorm Spearhead, and this one gets lots of support for the tanks and vehicles out there. Everything gets a single reroll when it attacks, so you're just a bit more dangerous than you would be otherwise. They've got some nice support such as returning fire and nice enhancements for Tech Marines, and then also gained an interesting themed one called Hammer of Avernii, basically a first company style detachment focused around the veteran units and dreadnoughts, and Karnok Var being kind of pivotal to that one to redesignate Oath of Moment to a new target. Ironstorm's alright as a detachment, though the Iron Hands are a bit rarely seen at the competitive level, both their characters providing some alright value but maybe not standout versus the competition. The Salamanders are the sons of Vulcan, a draconic and mighty primarch. They're masters of great forges and weaponsmiths, often fighting with relic artisan gear, and their preferred style of war is sheer might, immolating their enemies utterly, maybe fighting at close quarters with Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, and blasting tanks and infantry in great gouts of flame with their Prometheum or Melter weapons. They've got two unique characters in Adrax Agatone, who can hit all very hard with some Blade Guard, and makes them wound tough stuff that bit better, and Vulcanistan at the back here has had a recent new miniature that was all very fun. He's the Forge Father who seeks his Primarch's weapons, and he gives some enormous buffs to both Melter and Flame weapons with some big rerolls. The Salamanders are quite a well-liked army. They've got quite a nice colour scheme with their green armour and flames. They're known to be one of the slightly more humanitarian and relative good guy armies out of Warhammer 40k as it goes, and their unique detachment is quite an interesting one as well. The Firestorm Assault Force or the Forge Father Seekers, depending on which variant that you use. This allows you to advance and shoot with your ranged weapons and add one to the strength of them within 12 inches, which is pretty excellent both for their melters and flamers, and then have some pretty straightforward direct damage enhancements beyond that, plus some transport tricks which can be handy to deliver those units. I'd say they're also one of the relatively stronger chapters compared with some. Then finally for the mainline supported first founding chapters, we've got the Imperial Fists, the yellow armoured Sons of Dawn and Masters of Defensive Strategy. The Legion well famed for defending Terra during the Horus Heresy. Again, they maybe favour range over melee a bit more than some chapters out there. They're particularly well known for their fire discipline and great bolter gun lines to destroy the enemies advancing on their position, and their unique characters are these two on the right here, Darnath Lysandra, their first company, and Captain Torgaradon, both of which are fighting in heavy armour and well capable of putting the smack down on the biggest and toughest enemy things around. In game, these fortification and siege experts are maybe a little bit lower power than some on the tabletop. Both their characters are usable enough. Dawn hits hard with his Thunderhammer and makes a very tough Terminator force to take down with -1 to wound, and Torgaradon is a big threat to vehicles and monsters, though not really all that general purpose. Their themed attachment is the Anvil Siege Force, which I think is one that people really quite like, but doesn't really tend to do well in a competitive setting. It gives you the heavy keyword on all your guns and a +1 to wound if you're static. It can be quite strong if you're playing on a very open board where you don't have to move around too much and can see most of the enemy units, though on busier tournament boards with limited lines of sight, it's really going to have trouble. The rest of the stratagems broadly amp up firepower, and there's some helpful enhancements for things like Feel No Pain or Ignoring Cover. Lysander has a themed attachment as well with the Emperor's Shield. Overall, again, they tend to be one of the slightly lesser played armies on the competitive scene, though some people occasionally manage to make them work, and they're certainly strong enough for a casual setting. As ever, Space Marines are a pretty massive chunk of Warhammer 40k, with quite so many different flavours and options for how you can field them. They attract lots of people to collect. If you want to field a force of superhuman warriors, fighting with bolter, chainsword and power armour against the oncoming darkness of Xenos and Chaos, then the Space Marines might be for you. Before we move on to the other Imperial factions, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titans Terrain. They're one option for a battlefield worth of Warhammer 40k terrain if you want to get one on the table. They do things quite a lot differently to most out there with their folding cardboard system. Basically, the idea behind their stuff is that you have 12 tiles arranged in a 3x4 grid. Each one of those tiles unfolds and up pops a building. So you basically have an entire battlefield that can fold flat and store in a box set around about the same size as a normal board game. The main advantage of that is that just compared with the vast majority of terrain sets out there, you can store it in a really small space, and it means that if you don't have lots of room at home, it could be an okay choice, and can be handy enough if you want to take some terrain around to a friend's house, but don't have a huge amount of space to transport stuff. They've got a few different designs of it available. It has the advantage of not needing any hobby work to get it on the tabletop. It's ready to go straight away, and of course it's far cheaper than Games Workshop's terrain offerings, though you can say that about most. You can check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look, though I will circle back to them briefly at the end of the video to talk through their range. It's maybe one of the terrain sets with a few more obvious pros and cons compared with most, just due to being rather different. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Moving on, we've got the forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus. These are the Imperial forces that manufacture the Imperium's war material and weapons, and are an augmented cyborg army of the Forge Worlds, basically taking normal humans and doing horrific things to them, replacing arms, legs and parts of their minds with all manner of bionics and other things to make them do their job ruthlessly more efficiently. The Skitarii legions are basically programmed as much as they are commanded into battle, marching in lockstep and then fighting with all manner of techno-horrors, guns that spew radiation and plasma, and with their privileged place as the servants of some of the Imperium's finest scientist equivalents, they get a lot of the best technology and gear for themselves. As much as the Adeptus Mechanicus are a scientific or industrial organisation, they're a religious cult as well. worshipping the Omnissiah and appeasing the machine spirits of their weaponry. And despite most tech priests generally seeming to meddle to a greater lesser extent on things that they shouldn't do, innovation and experimenting with technology is largely banned, and there can be grave consequences for stepping out of line. For their model range, the AdMech have a recent and medium-sized miniature range. I feel like the miniatures are really quite cool, often having augmented robot-y sort of bits alongside flowing robes and some old-school looking technology, things like repeater rifles, clockwork horses, and Da Vinci-esque flying contraptions that maybe have a bit of a steampunk feel going on in some ways, and the range often divided a bit between the Skitarii with their more militaristic look, like the Skitarii Rangers on the right here, and the Cultists and more out-there tech units of the Cult Mechanicus and their Zealots. While the miniature range has lots of fun stuff, it's not without its criticisms though. They are kind of famous for being pretty detailed and hard to paint with all the stuff they've got going on, even on their most basic troops. And with a lot of fragile aerials and things, they can be a little harder to store than most, the winged Taraxi being particularly known for that. For some of their other technology, they employ automata directly programmed with floppy disk administered by their datasmith. They've got a hovercraft sort of Normandy landing style transport in the Scorpius Dune Rider, deploying Skitarii Rangers or Vanguards to the front, running down the frontal assault ramp, and here are some mechanical horses in the Cerberus Raiders, carrying scouting Skitarii to the front. They're presided over by their tech priests, the high one being Belisarius Cawl, and a pretty major figure with the Imperium in general, responsible for the entire Primaris project and ongoing things with countering the warp with Necron technology. And they do have some heavier gun tanks as well, such as the Onager Dune Crawler and the Scorpius Disintegrator, laying down some heavy firepower with relic weapons such as neutron lasers. Pricing maybe tends to be some of the worst news for the AdMech though. They're famed for being one of the most expensive armies to collect in Warhammer 40k, full stop. A few of the units have got slightly more points intensive recently, but it still remains that if you spend money here, you're probably going to get fewer points on the board than the majority of other factions out there. Quite a lot of their boxes come in 5s and 3s and are ultimately still normal humans, even if they're augmented ones, and it just means that overall they don't have lots of power on the board per unit. Their combat patrol isn't particularly well enjoyed either, being one of the single boxes with the lowest points out there. Gameplay wise, their rules are in Codex Adeptus Mechanicus. They're one of the units that had really quite a lot of updated rules and errata in the balanced update slate. It feels like half the profiles in the army and the core rule have all changed in major ways. Their main core rule is Doctrine or Imperatives. For your whole army you get to choose either Conqueror or Protector each turn, broadly either sit and shoot or be aggressive and advance. Both of them can be the right choice. The shooting one augments your ballistic skill and can have you hitting very hard indeed. Protector can get your firepower where it needs faster and is particularly nice in melee with a +1 to hit in close combat if the troops stay close. Playstyle wise, they tend to be more of a ranged faction as opposed to a melee one, though they do have a few close combat units. Quite a lot of their roster are sort of medium tier skirmish units that can be used for board control and objectives and things, and their firepower units often go in for big layered buffs, lots from the Doctrine or Imperatives, nearby characters maybe, and having some of their battle line units nearby such as the Rangers or Vanguard tends to increase the abilities of lots of units in the army. Until very recently they were pretty well the single strongest army in Warhammer 40k. They have had some points increases since then, but despite that are still decently strong. Top lists at the moment often tend to start with Belisarius Cawl and have him mark targets for some really heavy firepower to just utterly destroy things, and then fight for the mid-board with a good number of their infantry and skirmish units, perhaps the Carrion Constructs and Taraxi winging around to do board control and bully lighter units out there, and either use Halo Screed Battle Clays or the Skitarii Hunter cohort with its stealth tricks. In any case, if you want a rather disturbing force of mechanical infantry doing dodgy things with technology and some stylish Martian red flowing robes, the AdMech might be for you. Moving on, and next up we have the Astra Miltiarum, aka the Imperial Guard, and these guys basically represent the mass ranks of mortal humans defending the galaxy against the endless horrors of Warhammer 40k. Just the mere thought about fighting against the majority of the Xenos or Chaos factions is almost certainly going to be bad news, maybe giving people a lot of empathy with the normal humans just trying to deal with it. They have a bit more of a traditional military vibe and structure compared with most Warhammer 40k armies out there, fairly recognisable infantry, tanks and artillery, and often make war with a sort of 20th century military kind of vibe. Lumbering tanks with sponsons, maybe bayonet charges, and perhaps supported by some cavalry and heavy gun fire support. They do of course have plenty of 40k stuff thrown in, Scout Walker Sentinels, plasma guns, 4 special weapons, all the fancy Imperial adornment, and the basic small arms of the las guns, an easily mass-produced energy weapon. Like the Space Marines, in the background they have countless regiments fighting across the galaxy. They're drawn from local fighting forces, and often are wearing different kits or fighting with different styles, though Games Workshop tends to focus on a few of those specifically with their miniature ranges. For their models, they're one of Games Workshop's largest and most established factions out there, dating back to the very start of the setting. Plenty of versions of normal human infantry, some manning some big guns or technology, and then a notably high number of different battle tanks and artillery variations. They like their armoured fighting vehicles of all descriptions. The army has a few distinct themes, plenty of Cadian shock troops fighting with their sort of Starship Troopers style armour, relatively generic sci-fi soldiers. There's the gas mask Death Corps of Krieg, who have some nods to, say, World War I infantry, and then the Kaschan infantry line with a bunch of mini Rambos. That's one of Games Workshop's slightly embarrassingly dated miniature lines at the moment. They used to have more choices for different regiments out there, originally made in metal, though those have eventually gone away. It does mean that if you want to represent certain guard regiments from the lore, you might well be best off going to other sources for different miniatures and not Games Workshop. For some examples of their range, here's their Cadian shock troops, mass guardsmen to hold the line and still holding the fight despite the destruction of the Cadian Gate by Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade. It's often been the law in the past that lots of guard regiments sort of ape their gear and style as the excuse for lots of these units fighting across the galaxy. Their trusty, sturdy and most iconic battle tank is the Lehman Russ, a big lumpy tank with an enormous amount of different gun options. There's variants such as the Gatling Tank Punisher or the Tank Hunting Vanquisher. Regiments might be supported by Abhuman Auxilia, the Chunky Bullgrin, or the diminutive Sniping Ratlings. The morale and duty of the infantry lines are often overseen by the grim gaze of the regiment's commissars, ready to execute cowards who flee before the enemy. And should they have the resources and the situation require it, they can deploy the mighty Baneblade Super Heavy Tank, a rolling fortress of adamantium all covered in guns, and a pretty iconic unit that many recognise from the Dawn of War series. As mentioned, their recent Death Corps refresh was a pretty well received one. Their command squad has got some fun models with commissars overseeing it. The regular Kriegsmen are quite fun, and I really quite like the artillery team with its choice of different guns and its sandbags all built up there. You can field an entire army themed around them, or potentially have different squads from mixed regiments fighting together for the Imperium. Another theme within the army are the Tempestus Scions. These are sort of the Special Forces Shock Elite, trained by the prestigious Scholar Progenium, and they're deployed by Valkyries into some of the most dangerous and pivotal situations, well capable of tangling with the enemy elites with special weapons and hotshot lasguns. Price-wise, again, if you go mainly via the Games Workshop route, the Astra Miltiarum are going to be one of the priciest armies out there. Being normal humans where almost every foe is going to be their equivalent or better, it means that lots of their units just don't really cost all that many points to field in-game, and in particular if you want to go heavy on the new Death Corps or their infantry units in general, then you're going to be paying lots of money to get points on the board. If you want to take the excess of that a bit, then the tanks generally tend to do a bit better on that front, and they also are an army that's particularly well served by either second-hand miniatures or third-party proxies. There's plenty of ways that you can do generic humans in sci-fi armour with lasguns, and loads of other companies have made that sort of thing. Wargames Atlantic is a popular one, that's kind of on brand as well, that they'll fight with different gear and styles in different areas of the galaxy. Gameplay-wise, their rules are in Codex Astra Militarum. The core rule for the army is their voice of command and orders, having a command structure where they can dish out orders to their squad, telling them to move faster, shoot straighter, or hold an objective at all cost. It does mean that they can be quite a nuanced army to play, with some big decisions as to how you position units, protect your commanders, and make sure things are getting where they need to. For their playstyle, they're far more of a ranged army versus a melee army, most of their troops armed with ranged weapons, and then the tanks being the main way that they deal heavy damage to things. Typical armies will often have expendable infantry to hold the midboard at all cost, with some lumbering tanks protected behind them, beating down the enemy with some massive firepower. They've got specific detachments that can go heavier on tank things, or potentially support some more horde infantry builds like the recon element, and they've got all manner of different things that you can have different flavours for that, say some Bullgrin to bully for the midboard, or some big guns and artillery to hit enemy units that the rest of your things can't see, though a lot of their artillery is rather underpowered in 10th edition. At the moment though, guards seem to be having a rather good time of it. While gameplay power often changes, at the moment they've been enjoying their Grizzle Company detachment, which just very directly makes guard a bit more flexible and dangerous. They have a few more orders going round, get some big rerolls to hit and maybe wound against key targets. It's particularly nice for supporting tank damage, Kazakin out of transports, maybe Bullgrin on the front line, and Rough Riders charging into close combat. In any case, if you want an army of the normal humans fighting with more traditional military tactics to bring down the enemies of the Emperor, then the Astra Militarum might be the army for you. Next up, we have the Golden Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes. These are essentially the Emperor's own Space Marine Legion, more or less, though in reality are augmented far more than more standard Space Marines, each Custodian essentially being the equivalent to a hero of any other army. Not just a god-tier warrior on the battlefield, but also a great thinker, strategist, and philosopher, and then equipped with some of the most ridiculously valuable weapons that the Imperium can produce, many of which have secret technology that not even the Adeptus Mechanicus has access to. Traditionally, they've served as the guardians of Holy Terror itself, the 10,000 standing strong to defend the throne world as the last line of defence to protect the Emperor himself, though increasingly in the era Indomitus, Guilliman has ordered the Custodes to take a more active stance in the defence of the galaxy, and as a result might dispatch either emissaries or entire armies to end threats before they happen. They'll always be outnumbered, but each individual guy is often capable of defeating hundreds of enemies just literally by himself. They typically deploy as a very, very heavily armoured shield line, infantry with shields and guardian spears, and dreadnoughts with some exotic technology, and in the lore are pretty much some of the absolute pinnacle fighters in the setting. For their miniature range, they have a relatively small plastic range in Warhammer 40k, most of it being various flavours of super elite infantry, really quite detailed models covered in eagle motifs, and typically tend to get painted in their iconic gold colour scheme, though certain shield hosts can use slight variations or different colours. It does mean that their core army is kind of limited, but it's not really too much effort to collect up a pretty well-rounded force if you want to, and that can be an advantage. You really don't need too many models to have a Custodes army, and it's really quick to paint and easy to transport, and it certainly costs far less. Perhaps one of the biggest downsides to the Custodes is that lots of their range is still in Forge World resin, which means that if you want things like their fancy dreadnoughts, Caladius tanks, or various other expanded options, then it costs far, far more than just about anything else does at the moment. Though hopefully in the not too distant future, a fair bit of that should be converted to plastic. We don't 100% know whether it will stick around for 40k in the long term though, until Games Workshop confirms one way or the other. In any case, for a look through their miniature range, the Custodian Guard on the left are basically their default choice, with the choice of the Guardian Spear or Sentinel Blade and Shield. On the right we've got the Allarus Custodians, armed in Terminator armour. They're slayers of champions and can warp across the board. The Virtus Praetors are their jet bikes. I must admit I really quite enjoy the eagle-mounted front of the jet bike. They have a bit of heavy firepower and then can take down hard targets with their Interceptor Lancers. And then they often take to the field supported by the other talon of the Emperor, the Sisters of Silence. These girls are psychic gnolls who can basically cancel out any warp threats. They're really just represented by the one main model kit in the Custodes range at the moment, so you can arm them with a few different weapons. They've got a few character miniatures, including Trajan Valoris, the Captain General of the Custodes. He's a High Lord of Terror. And then here's just a couple of the Forge World range of the Custodes. They've got the Venatari Custodians with the jump packs. I quite like their unique dreadnoughts as well. Here's the Contemptor Achilles, armed with essentially an enormous Guardian Spear. They're all very ornate and fine looking. I certainly enjoy them being in plastic myself. I would likely focus on collecting the core range of Custodes with the plastic as opposed to Forge World stuff until it gets updated though. Pricing is definitely a positive for this army, at least compared with just about anything else in 40k, and if you stick to their core plastic range, it's fairly easy to label this one the single cheapest army to play in Warhammer 40k currently, and perhaps it's somewhat ironic, but also partly due to their hyper-elite status, as every army is sort of like a demigod of combat. You don't really need all that many of them to fill out an army, and in particular their combat patrol is a fairly god tier one compared with the rest of the armies out there. You get 3 out of their 5 major plastic kits, and you could easily get multiple to fill out their battle line, and you can even build some shield captains and HQs out of the models in the box themselves as well. Gameplay wise, their rules are found in Codex Adeptus Custodes. Being quite so scary models in their own right, they generally have pretty enormous stat lines. You're likely to be confronting opponents with a huge toughness 6, 2+ save, and 4+ invulnerable bodies, and that means that small arms and lighter attacks will do very little against them, and they even shrug off a good number of heavy attacks depending on how well you're feeling like rolling 4+s that days. Their attacks hit on a 2+, both at range and in melee. They generally tend to be more of a melee army versus a ranged one, and in close combats they get further damage buffs, with Martial Qatar allowing you to either flex into lethal or sustained hits and give you the best fighting chance into every target out there. Their most standard playstyle might be just having lots of heavy armoured infantry, moving them onto the mid-board objectives and daring the opponents to come close enough so you can charge them. It does mean that they can sometimes be a slightly frustrating army to play against, a bit more of a stat check as to whether or not you can do enough damage to win the game, and maybe a little bit less capacity for clever moves than some, though obviously you can absolutely command them better or worse, and given that quite a lot of their army is somewhat slow moving, you're going to have to think hard about where you move them and deploy them, as you're not going to be able to jump around too much after. For their current power, they're kind of middling at the moment. Some recent points cuts certainly haven't hurt the faction, but regardless of how powerful they are, they usually tend to be an army that do better in sort of casual games that don't have quite as much damage output as opposed to hyper-competitive play, just due to their relatively simplistic playstyle. If you want a big chunky and terrifying host of Golden Guardians to crush the enemies of the Emperor with Guardian Spear and Aura Might though, then the Adeptus Custodes might be for you, and they certainly have some advantages with the cheapness and ease of getting an army together. Next up, we've got the Holy Forces of the Adepta Sororitas. These are the Sisters of Battle and the Defenders of the Imperial Faith. These girls came about as the militant wing of the ecclesiarchy, as they were forbidden to bear men under arms, though that doesn't apply to women, and they truly became a major player in the Imperium after the Age of Apostasy and Reign of Blood, where a certain Mr. Vandar began to consolidate power and try and usurp the Emperor. His fanatical guards, known as the Brides of the Emperor, were convinced to turn against him when he was eventually denounced, and Alicia Dominica and her sisters went on to found the Adeptus Sororitas, the defenders of the Imperial Faith, with orders spread throughout the galaxy, keeping watch on the Imperium's borders for heresy and chaos, but also rooting out witches and threats within. When they take to the fight, they tend to be normal infantry, but quite well supplied ones, fighting in a lighter version of Space Marine power armour, and often tend to go in for close-range firepower, burning the witches with flamers and melter weapons. Their faith also seems to mysteriously be rewarded sometimes, the Emperor's light and psychic interference shining down upon them, and for a zealous sister in a dire situation, miracles can truly happen. For their miniature range, they languished as a very badly supported army in 40k's history for a long time, though were eventually redone in big style during 8th edition, their current plastic range being a broadly pretty well received one, elite human infantry in power armour with a good bunch of religious style trappings, lots of censers and burning braziers, using the emblem of the fleur-de-lis, and a fair few angelic stylings as well. Games Workshop updated their army in quite a big way. They're fairly well established, with the majority of battlefield roles filled by them. As well as the core sisters range, you also have the Ministorum style units as well, more sort of penitent Imperial zealots and sinners, but also Imperial clergy forces, all fighting for the Imperial faith. On the left here we have their base troops in the standard Battle Sister squad, some nice flowing robes there, and some creepy cherub constructs hovering above them. The Seraphim and Zephyrim are particularly fun, descending on angelic wings to put the enemy down with dual pistols or close combat weapons. Here's a rather unlucky sinner who's been strapped to a penitent engine, sent into battle in basically a torture construct, feeding off his light essence to slam into the enemy with buzzblades whirring. And there's a bit of holy firepower on the right with the Castigator tank, essentially a Sisters Predator tank with a bunch of their styling and finery. Some of their character miniatures are particularly central and impressive. Celestine's a very nice model, soaring above the host as living saints restored from death from the Emperor, and the Triumph of St. Catherine is a very unusual model in 40k, basically an entire funeral procession with sisters from the different orders bearing each of their own relics, and can provide great inspiration to the sisters around them. Again, as armies of Warhammer 40k go, the Sisters of Battle tend to be one of the most expensive armies to collect, maybe a little behind armies like Admech and Guard, though there's not an enormous amount in it. Again, like the Admech, this partly comes from just the idea of them being more normal humans, even if they're fancily equipped ones, so it can mean that they need quite a lot of units. And also being at least a relatively recent release faction doesn't particularly help with that either. Particularly any of their 5 model elite units tend to be really quite low in terms of the amount of points on the board for the money. Gameplay-wise, they do have some fun stuff. Their rules are found in Codex Adeptus Sororitas, and their most core rule is the Acts of Faith. This basically gives you a pool of miracle dice to set aside. You roll them as the turns go on, and you trigger certain other conditions, and then you have that number set aside on the edge of the board, and you can sub them into certain key rolls occasionally, maybe guaranteeing that you make an absolutely pivotal charge, or perhaps getting that automatic wound that you need with a melter shot, or pass a saving throw that you'd really like to make. I do quite like the way that the mechanic goes with their lore. For their more general playstyle, maybe their biggest theme tends to be units that want to shoot the enemy hard at close range, particularly with their melter and flamer weapons for a lot of them, but they certainly have plenty of melee things on offer as well. With a lot of toughness 3 normal human profiles, they don't tend to be all that sturdy to return fire though. A lot of the time things are going to be able to jump out, deal some serious damage, but then get shot down in return. And it does mean that they might be having to use some careful use of terrain, or some of their transport vehicles to get them where they need to go. For in-game power, I'd still say they're solidly good at the moment. They were one of the stronger factions in Warhammer 40k, at least on the competitive scene until recently. They were hit by a few nerfs, including a slightly punishing one to Retributors. They're still very capable of being pretty terrifying when commanded by a good general though. Quite a few of their detachments are at least usable. Maybe the ones that get the most focus are the Hallowed Martyrs, where they've got the ability to have their characters rise from the ashes after being laid low. Plus it also supports melee quite well. And the Champions of Faith, which focus on their elites, like this Paragon Warsuit here or the Celestian Sacrosancts. In any case, if you want a faithful host of Imperial nuns, purging the godless and the heretics with Melter and Flamer, the Adeptus Sororitas might be for you. Moving on to some great Titanic nobles, we have the force of the Imperial Knights. These guys are essentially Imperial nobility with houses, heritage and heraldry, fighting in great Titanic warsuits known as the Imperial Knights, enormous super heavy walkers equipped with weapons the size of battle tanks and thunderous Titanic close combat weapons. Typically a force of knights will have some big Titanic ones at the centre to represent the pinnacle of the nobility of the household, and then be supported by various armiger squires, piloting smaller war mechs that go around them, and are capable of maintaining the battle line or hunting down errant enemies. The knightly households tend to pledge themselves either to the Imperium or the Mechanicus' Forge Worlds, and perhaps most typically tend to take to the field in lore, fighting alongside other Imperial elements, and very often skirmishing or countering their Chaos rivals, various households serving the great enemy in one way or another. Model-wise, they really are quite unusual within Warhammer 40k, essentially an entire army of big stompy mech suits. So it means that the army that you put on the table might be, say, 3 big Titanic Knights like this one on the right here, and then maybe around 5 smaller armigers at perhaps a 2000 point level. And they can look really quite striking on the battlefield, with a whole bunch of really big centerpiece models in the army. They're at least a relatively recent faction as Warhammer 40k goes, the first kit coming out in 2014 and expanding from there. They've got 3 major knight classes in normal plastic kits for 40k, and then a few things beyond that from either Forge World or the Heresy range, but still have current rules to fill them in Warhammer 40k. It does mean that compared with some armies out there's a bit less variety in the faction, with every single model basically being a super heavy walker, and often the only differences are war gear choices. For their major knightly classes, we've got the Dominus pattern on the left. They're sort of huge walking gun turrets. This one's the close range Knight Valiant with a harpoon and great flamer. The armigers are the smaller knights. This one's a fire support Helverin armed with a pair of autocannons. And then the most standard and flexible class of knight is the Questoris. This one's a Warden pattern with the Avenger Gatling cannon, absolutely annihilating enemy infantry formations, and they can fight either with Power Fist or Chainsword. Here's a couple of the Forge World and Heresy styled knights, the Cerastus Knight Lancer being a great tall striding knight, hurtling into close combat and hitting hard when it gets here, and then there's the really big Acastus Porphyrion, huge even by knightly standards, and that one being a super expensive Forge World resin kit. Price-wise, the knights tend to be on the cheaper end of the Warhammer 40k spectrum. They don't really get discount deals, and their miniatures tend to be sort of medium-ish in terms of the points that you get on the board, probably towards the slightly better end compared with some out there though. I feel like the real strength of the Imperial Knights though is that you're really quite likely to complete a collection at least relatively quickly compared with some. There's only so many different knight variants that you can get, and particularly if you make use of some magnets, you can basically have the same patterns of knights represent just about all units in the codex, so you can field virtually anything. Compared with most armies, they're generally a faster army to paint up as well. Each project is going to be a really big one, but you can do a lot of the heavy lifting with spraying the panels before you put them on the sort of knight skeleton, and then fill in detail from there, but already have at least a somewhat effective force on the tabletop. Gameplay-wise, being an unusual army, they play very different to most armies out there. Every single one of your models is going to be a force to be reckoned with. Pretty tough models with lots of wounds and then some vehicle class weapons, so things that are going to be able to threaten really tough stuff in the opponent's army, and usually a mix of heavy firepower and close combat stuff. The Titanic Knights get some special rules of their own, being able to smash straight through terrains, so the things on the board aren't really going to limit them too much as to where they go. They can give out bondsman abilities to empower armigers nearby, and their core army rule is the Code Chivalric, giving you a boost to your army and a quest to do with some command points as a reward for achieving it. With the whole army being big scary vehicles, it does mean that again like Custodes they're going to be a rather simplistic army to play, stomping about and doing pretty enormous damage to things that the enemy exposes. They're often going to be pretty good at winning direct one-on-one confrontations with enemy armour, but at the same time can be a bit ponderous, and having all your might clustered in just a few big units can mean that when the opponent gets the jump on them, say from hiding behind terrain and jumping out, then they can be in the position to do some pretty enormous damage to your forces. It's not really so much the case in the competitive game, but certainly on more casual games, there can be an element as to whether or not the opponent has brought enough anti-tank as to whether or not they can handle knights or not, and they don't really tend to work quite as well at lower points levels compared with bigger ones. After having a month or so where there was the single strongest faction in Warhammer 40k, they're now weaker than most currently. The Codex attachment's not really being quite as powerful as the Index one that came before, and possibly could be an army that Games Workshop might choose to help at the next balance pass perhaps. In any case though, if you want a pretty striking looking army of stompy nobles marching up the board and laying about the enemy with Titanic class weapons, the Imperial Knights might be for you. Next up we have the Imperial Agents, these guys basically representing the Inquisition forces of the Imperium, plus various other support assets and interesting things from the background that are out there in the lore in Warhammer 40k that maybe don't really neatly fit into any one other army's organisation. These guys have been variously playable or not in different forms in Warhammer 40k's past. At the moment they have their codex under the flag of Imperial Agents, and that gathers together a bunch of Inquisition forces, the Rogue Traders and Imperial Navy, the Imperial Assassins and the Adeptus Arbites. The Inquisition feel like the main focus of the book, and certainly if you're trying to collect them as an army in their own right, they often coordinate the Imperium from the shadows, having their unquestioned authority. At their word, entire armies can be requisitioned, and planets can live or be put to exterminatus. The Ordo Hereticus seeks to root out hidden chaos threats and burn the witches. The Ordo Malleus is the counter-demon order, and often works somewhat closely with the Grey Knights, and the Ordo Xenos study and counter the major alien threats out there, and might deploy some surgical strikes with Deathwatch kill teams to win great victories at comparatively lower cost, as well as their primary and militant wings that are often accompanied by all manner of retinues of Imperial forces, maybe deploying the sinister agents of the Officio Assassinorum to bring down enemy leaders, perhaps bolstered by some shipboard fighters of the Imperial Navy, and might choose to fight alongside other Imperial commanders, their interference and sanctions often causing tensions with Imperial forces. With the nature of their study, several of the Inquisitors are rather radical as well, treading a dangerous path with using the tools of the enemy against them, and might unusually employ some Xenos weapons or heretical demon hosts or something to aid them in their fight. For their miniatures, they feel like a bit of a weird faction within Warhammer 40k. It's partly due to their nature, but they're basically a mishmash of all sorts of things stuck together in one miniature range. They don't really have so much of an overarching theme. They have some Inquisitors and the Assassins as their own character miniatures, some Battle Sisters, Grey Knights and Deathwatch, the core troops choices taken from various other codexes, a few henchmen and zealots with the Sanctifiers, and then a good few Imperial kill team kits as well, things like the Road Traders, Navy Breachers, or the Adeptus Arbites. As it's not really within their lore, they don't really have their own big tanks or armoured units so much, just a few borrowed transport vehicles for those troops, and they do feel like they may be missing a few kits that could help tie the range together a bit more, perhaps some Inquisitorial Stormtroopers, and it's kind of weird that we don't have a permanently on sale model for a generic Inquisitor. For examples of their model range, here we have Inquisitors to represent the three major Ordos, Inquisitor Cotias of the Ordo Malleus, fighting with Hammer and Cyber Eagle, though people were really not too happy with his sculpt. Kyria Draxus of the Xenos, fighting with a little familiar and a looted shuriken catapult, and Inquisitor Greyfax of the Ordo Hereticus, or very Spanish Inquisition looking with that hat and a condemner bolt gun. Here's a couple of their retinues with the Inquisitorial Agents who can make a few interesting characters, basically a minor command squad for the Inquisition, and the Adeptus Arbites is basically the Imperial elite police force to take down high-level threats to the Emperor's justice. The Assassins are pretty fun and fairly storied in their own right. Here's the soul horror that is the Colexus that cuts Psychers off from the warp, and many a rebellion or insurrection has been ended via a single shot from a Vindicator's bullet from afar. And then as mentioned, you can deploy their militant wing units, Battle Sisters, Grey Knights or Deathwatch. Price-wise, if you go with all the official Games Workshop kits, they are quite likely to be expensive relative to most, though I feel like as factions go, there's probably less expectation to field them as a great big 2,000 point army compared with some armies out there. It just really doesn't seem to be what Games Workshop's going for, so I suspect a fair few people might collect them as slightly smaller forces for more narrative games or allying into other Imperial factions. Most of the kill team units are at least fairly expensive for the amount of points that you get on the board though, perhaps the Grey Knight Terminators being one of the easiest ways to get some points down for less money than normal. With quite a lot of normal human medium elite infantry, there might be one that you could use some proxies for as well to help out. Gameplay and army design wise though, and we get into probably the main problems with Imperial Agents. First up, they certainly feel like they're a faction that might get heavily reinterpreted one edition to another. They might well be kind of similar in how you can use them in 11th edition for all we know, though they could change up the formula once again. Currently they basically have them both so you can field them as an allied army, adding in units to other Imperial forces, or put them together in their own force, and they have different points values depending on which one you choose. The idea is that at different points levels you can field a certain amount of allied agent units. Say at 2,000 point strike force you can have up to 2 retinue units, characters, and 1 requisitioned unit. It does mean that they can be quite fun to throw into other Imperial factions for lore and theming things. Mostly the choices don't tend to be all that strong, perhaps the most popular for competitive lists being a Calidus Assassin to bounce around the board doing secondary objectives. When fielding on their own though, I feel like Games Workshop really has done them a disservice so far. Compared with every other faction out there, they don't actually have an overarching army rule when they're fielded solo. It maybe feels a bit lazy given that it wouldn't really be all that hard to give them one via a balance pass or something. Though beyond that, the army's got more issues as well. As you're basically fielding an entire force worth of lighter characters and skirmish infantry, you don't really tend to have too much as really heavy damage dealers. And if you want to take down tough stuff, that's kind of left to the Deathwatch, Grey Knights, and maybe any allied Imperial Knights that you take along. All of which can work, but none are really super efficient at taking down enemy tanks and vehicles. It means that the army at the moment kind of tends to play as a slightly weird skirmish sort of force. They do have detachments for the different Ordos, though more people tend to use the Imperialis fleet one. That one has some interesting options for deployment with infiltrating and deep strike, and it's quite nice for the Navy units. Between all this, they're basically super underpowered relative to the other factions in Warhammer 40k, and seem to be basically the one army that Games Workshop's not bothering to balance in any form. Basically for these guys, if you want the more normal Warhammer 40k playing experience, then these probably aren't the ones to go for. They're more sort of a fun and lore style army, there to provide some thematic allies for the other Imperial factions, and probably going to be on the back foot and on hard mode if you're playing any normal style game. Plenty of people out there have still got some solid collections going though, and with the fun factor of the Force it doesn't necessarily put off everyone. In any case, if you want to wield the forces of the Inquisition on the tabletop, and have a lot of unusual Imperial forces from various corners of the galaxy and backgrounds of the setting, the Imperial Agents could be for you. Next up, and focusing on the Ordo Malleus arm of the Inquisition, we have the Grey Knights. These guys were founded by the Emperor and Malcador, and are the secret 666 chapter of Space Marines, operating from the shadowy moon of Titan, and very few in the Imperium know that they exist. And it's basically their job to counteract and fight the forces of the Warp wherever they manifest, and kick the Chaos Demons back into the Imperium. Where Space Marines are elite forces, the Grey Knights are next level, as basically every single battle brother is an incorruptible psyker. Psychic talents basically needed to counteract and banish demons more efficiently, and activate their force weapons with which they fight, and basically have an interesting blend of high technology and sanctic battle magic, both being needed to take down their foes made of warp stuff. In battle they often fight with teleport tactics, and utilise some great Dread Knight warsuits to banish greater demons. They're guided to their foes by the prognosticars, psychers who sense where demons are going to manifest, so the Grey Knights can show up in time to counter them. They're perhaps particularly well known for having some fairly wild lore, both past and present. Their chapter master Caldor Drago carved his name onto Mortarian's heart and is currently crusading through the warp. And more recently they've had their entire Terminus degree thing, apparently advising them that if the Emperor ever gets off his throne to be a chaos deity, they need to immediately try and put him back. Miniatures wise, they're basically Space Marines with a knightly theming, plenty of maces and force swords and halberds and things, a fair bit of advanced technology relative to some other chapters out there, and then quite a lot of scripts and incantations and books and things, all to show their role as banishing their demonic foes. Armies generally tend to be fairly compact, small and elite, even relative to other Space Marines, and tend to be painted in their customary silver armour. The miniature range is one of the most criticised in Warhammer 40k at the moment. It's really quite a small miniature range, and one that's showing its age in 40k relative to the rest. Their kits are from around 5th edition, and they're now pretty notably the only Space Marine faction that hasn't had some major Primaris scaling updates. It seems very likely indeed that in 11th edition Games Workshop's going to give them a proper refresh, so likely some power armour and Terminator sculpts at a Primaris scale. They haven't really got that many miniatures on sale full stop, most of their army revolving around 2 infantry style kits, big Dread Knights to tower over them like this one, and just a couple of character miniatures. They do have access to a few Space Marine generic units, though not really all that many, things like Land Raiders and Rhinos to support them. Here are their 2 core infantry kits. The Strike Squad is a 10-man box set for their power armoured Marines, with options for force swords and halberds and wrist-mounted stormbolters, plus some special weapons mixed in with the unit. They can be built and fielded as 4 different specialist variants. Grey Knights are particularly well known for their Terminators as well, just showcasing how elite the chapter is with large amounts of Battle Brothers deployed that way, and I must admit I do quite like the look of their knightly helms. For bigger stuff, they've got the Nemesis Dread Knight, that's their greater demon fighting suit. Unfortunately not really a model with a great reputation for looks within Warhammer 40k. People say that it looks like a baby carrier a bit, though not everyone hates it. They can also field dreadnoughts and other generic Space Marine things, though I feel like a lot of it could be outstanding for an update along with the Primaris Marines in 11th edition. Their character range is sorely lacking as well. They only have the 2 standard character sculpts at the moment on sale, Grandmaster Voldus and Castellan Crow. Castellan Crow's got really quite a nice miniature with his cursed blade, and he's the only one at the newer scale update and kind of shows what they'll do with the rest of the army eventually. They can field a lot of other characters, though the expectation is that you either use the generic Marine versions from Core Codex Space Marines or kit bash them out of Terminators. As you can see, their miniature range has quite a lot to criticise about it at the moment, though it also does come with the upside that they're pretty much rivaling with the Custodes as one of the single cheapest factions to collect in Warhammer 40k at the moment. In particular, their Strike Squads and Terminator Squads get a lot of points on the board for not really all that much money. If you wanted to economise further, you could stretch a box of Strike Marines to make even more ones if you can find a cheap source of bodies somewhere. Maybe some Horus Heresy bodies, and the Combat Patrol box set does get you a lot of points on the board, though it isn't really that good to multiply due to Castellan Crow, and a lot of people weren't really too much of a fan of the Dreadnought in it, again really feeling like one of the models that's going to get phased out, with the Redemptor Dreadnoughts basically as the successor to them. Perhaps one of the biggest issues is that we just don't know 100% just how compatible the current range of Grey Knight miniatures might be with whatever form they take after a big model refresh for the faction. I'm sure standard things like Terminators and Strike Marines will be very playable. There's probably more question marks on a lot of the rest though. In-game in Codex Grey Knights, they have some rather unusual rules. 10th edition reinterpreted them with the ability to basically blink on and off the board via their teleport assaults. The rule is that you can return units to reserve and then teleport them somewhere else to respond to new threats. It means that they can be really quite mobile and make sure that their units are always relevant. It often means that they're going to be quite good at scoring objectives and points and things, but it's not particularly helpful for reliably delivering them into melee combat, where they often tend to do most of their damage. Beyond that, their general playstyle is that you're going to have a smallish amount of elite infantry, maybe with some dread knights for heavy lifting and fire support. Most of their shooting is relatively close range, 24 inches or less, and then a lot of their threat comes from their force weapons in melee, where they'll be fairly punchy at taking down enemy heavy infantry. They have sometimes been a bit limited against hard targets like vehicles and monsters in the past, and at the moment they might often lean fairly heavily on Grandmaster Dread Knights to get that role filled. For their current power levels, they're kind of middling and well balanced right now. The top list are using plenty of Purifiers, Dread Knights, and other support units, maybe mainly in the Warpbane Task Force. That's the Purifier themed detachment where you can get some big rerolls for all your damage, and it's a pretty reliable way to make them far more dangerous than otherwise. In any case, if you're not too worried about an impending range release and still want to collect an army of demon hunting secret space marines from Titan, the Grey Knights might well be the army for you. Finally, for the Imperium, and cycling back to the Space Marines once more, we have the Divergent chapter codexes, and these are the ones that basically represent Space Marine chapters that do things a little differently. The Grey Knights tend to operate a bit more separately and off on their own with very limited access to other Space Marine units, but for the next 5 chapters, these can basically field most of the Space Marine toys, but then have a bunch of their own unique stuff on top of that, and their own detachments. First of these, we have the Dark Angels. They were originally the first Legion of Space Marines and are the unforgiven descendants of Lionel Johnson. They fight as a secretive and monastic knightly order, lots of shadowy hoods, swords and long robes and censer bearers. A lot of their chapters' lore and backstory revolve around the hunt for the fallen, the Dark Angels that fell to the machinations of chaos during the Horus Heresy and turned against the chapter and the Emperor. They keep this hunt strictly secret from the wider Imperium and employ their own unique fighting formations to go after them. A unique Ravenwing Hunter Biker Company for their second company. They track down and scout out the enemy positions before calling in the Inner Circle and their Deathwing First Company in Terminator armor, teleporting in to deliver the hammer blow. They've had a fair amount of lore focus in the recent 40k setting, their Primarch Lionel Johnson finally returning to them from ages past and leading the chapter through the Imperium Nihilus in an uncertain future. For their model range, as with the rest of these ones, they can use the big Space Marine model range, so basically have a vast amount of options should they want to, and if any of the Space Marine models appeal to you, you can add them to your army. The Dark Angels do have really quite a solid range of their own unique miniatures as well, many of them having been redone for 10th edition in a range that was really quite well received. Several characters, the Deathwing Knights, unique Ravenwing units and the Inner Circle companions, plus their Primarch. Their models again have a rather knightly vibe to them, a particularly monastic one with hoods and robes and shadowy wings and things. Maybe these Inner Circle companions being a pretty good example. These guys have a fairly sinister vibe even if they are servants of the Imperium. Aside from their character models, a lot of their units are broadly divided into either their Deathwing units or Ravenwing. The Deathwing Knights are really quite fun knightly Terminator models that lots of people quite enjoyed. Great big shields with Dark Angels heraldry on them and fighting with swords or maces. They're pretty powerful in game as well. The Ravenwing models didn't get updates in 10th edition, so there's lots of suspicion that they'll have new things coming out in 11th. They've got their own unique biker units and speeders and planes, generally painted in black with some wings and things. At present though, if jumping into Dark Angels, I'd probably more focus on Deathwing and then see what turns up with the Ravenwing when they get their 11th edition codex. They do have a fairly good going cast of characters to represent their chapter high command. Lionel Johnson is really quite a cool model, fighting with the Emperor's shield and flanked by the Watchers in the Dark, rather sinister little eldritch horror familiars that often watch the chapter as they fight in battle and might bear relics for them. There's also miniatures like Master Lazarus or the Supreme Grandmaster Azrael. He's able to shield his squad from enemy attacks with the force fields of the Lion Helm. The Divergent chapters also have units that they're just known to get on with a bit better in the lore from the general Space Marine range. You might expect Dark Angels to use a fair few Outrider bikers to represent the Ravenwing in action, and they also have an affinity with plasma weapons, having lots of relics from the Dark Age of technology. Some Hellblasters or other plasma weapons could fit that theme quite well, and they also like their Interrogator chaplains as well, who I'm sure the Fallen really don't want to fall into the tender clutches of. Price-wise, being Space Marines, they're one of the cheaper Warhammer 40k armies to play, and I feel like Dark Angels do have some advantages even over them. They can use the discount deals that Space Marines have, and some of their units do get a lot of points on the board for the amount of money that they cost. Lionel Johnson and the Deathwing Knights in particular are quite good choices for that, and are both quite strong units that you might want in armies at the moment. They do just have the Space Marine thing though, where you could basically endlessly buy models, and if you want to chase the meta for the exact most powerful thing for Space Marines all the time, it could get expensive in the long run. Gameplay-wise, these Divergent chapters have maybe the slight disadvantage of needing 2 books to fill the official rules for them, both Codex Space Marines and then a Dark Angels supplement book that has their unique units in. If you want all the rules, they are split across both. They still use the Space Marine Oath of Moment, so some big rerolls against one target, and if you're fielding your units as Dark Angels, then the Bikers and Speeders gain the Raven Wing keyword, and Terminators and Veterans gain Deathwing. That matters a bit more in certain detachments than others, but there's plenty of stratagems that might be keyworded to one or the other. In terms of playstyle, you could field very different armies within Dark Angels. You could go heavy in their Raven Wing and have some enormous alpha strikes with Black Knights and Plasma Talons slamming into the enemy, or you could go rather Deathwing heavy, have 3 big sturdy blocks of Deathwing Knights and Lionel Johnson, and that would be a hugely intimidating force to deal with, as they're all quite tough units and particularly hard to charge in melee. Pretty hard work to deal with if they're stomping onto the mid-board and holding it against all comers. You can go heavy on either one of those elements and back them up with some more standard Green Wing elements for some fire support and utility roles. Top lists right now are often going for the Lion, Deathwing Knights and Azrael in army lists. The Inner Circle Companions can certainly pack a punch for their points cost, and wouldn't be surprised to see a few more Black Knights on the go now that they dropped in points. Currently they feel like they're a rather well balanced army, neither stand out strong nor stand out weak within Warhammer 40k, and lots of people are enjoying the Wrath of the Rock detachment for the Dark Angels that makes their infantry mightier and harder to kill. In any case, if you want some spooky sinister Space Marines with some hooded and robed knights fighting for the Emperor and their own mysterious agendas, the Dark Angels could be for you. For the other angelic Space Marines of Warhammer 40k, we've got the Blood Angels, originally the 9th Legion of Space Marines. These are the sons of the martyred winged Primarch Sanguinius, brutally slain by Horus at the climax of the Horus Heresy. The chapter's theme is that of sort of angelic fallen heroes, generally rather noble good guys in Warhammer 40k, and fighting tirelessly to defend the Imperium against a multitude of horrors that have a duality about them, being afflicted by 2 grave flaws. The Red Thirst basically gives them enormous amounts of anger and rage in battle, and if left unchecked, they can descend into wanton rage, anger and bloodlust if not controlled and channeled. At their worst, the Blood Angels can become bloodthirsty monsters, as liable to cause great harm to their friends as well as foes. This can be checked and measured and unleashed where appropriate, but then they also have the more insidious threat of the Black Raid. This is basically the despair and horror at the fate of their dying Primarch. It left a psychic signature on their chapter, and it's a flaw that can affect just about any of the Blood Angels, even the noblest and best controlled, basically being more haunted by visions of Sanguinius being killed by Horus, and basically slowly driven mad. Between that and the Red Thirst, they can absolutely be a danger to anything around them, and when that starts to happen in a big way, their Space Marines tend to self-sacrifice and take the black armour of the Death Company, seeking only a noble death in close combat presided over by their chaplains, and trying to take down as many of the Emperor's foes with them as they can before they go. When they make war, particularly with the Red Thirst, it tends to be in glorious close combat. They make great use of jump packs to get them there, having the genetic heritage of Sanguinius, who was winged, so their jump packs will send them bounding through the air to get to grips with the foe, slamming into them with an enormous amount of rage and carnage. Their chapter master Dante serves as Lord Regent of the Imperium Nihilus, and is certainly active in the setting, fighting against High Fleet Leviathan and helping out the Dark Angels in the events of Arcs of Omen. For their model range, again like the Dark Angels, they had a good few miniatures refreshed in 10th edition at Primaris scale, with quite a few unique character miniatures, and then a couple of options for squads, though those left quite a bit to be desired, and they can also field all the things from the big Space Marine range as well. The aesthetic has a lot of angel wings, death masks, and sort of sculpted armour plates, most of the chapter fighting in red, the Death Company having black plated armour, the elite guard to the chapter master fighting gold. As mentioned though, some of their core kits do have some big criticisms at the moment. People really weren't too happy about the reimagination of the Sanguinary Guard, in particular the heads and the jump packs not really being so well received compared with the past, to the point where there's a fair few 3D printing creators out there who have made versions with the wings back on. I'll link Great High Studios design down in the video description. Otherwise, the other major infantry theme that they have are the Death Company, and these are currently very lacking as well. You currently basically use the standard intercessors either on foot or the jump pack guys and give them just a couple of extra war gear bits, and they're meant to represent Death Company. And I'm almost 100% certain that that's just a stopgap, and they will be releasing a Death Company kit probably in 11th edition, maybe later. But to my mind, there's absolutely no chance they looked at the Blood Angels range and decided to redesign it, and decided to take the Death Company from having a standalone kit to having none, when it's one of only 2 major themes within the faction for unique units. For the majority of their unique releases though, their characters went down rather well. Commander Dante's a fairly fun one, fighting with Axe and Inferno pistol. Chief Librarian Mephiston is the only one to have ever thrown off the Black Rage. He's definitely going down the sort of slightly vampire style theme that a few of the Blood Angels have. Chaplain Lamartes is the Guardian of the Lost, shepherding the Death Company to a glorious end. They do have a couple of Firstborn miniatures still in their range as well, with the Baal Predator and its Flamestorm cannons, and I quite enjoy the Jump Chaplain as well. Given the treatment of Firstborn Marines though, I'm not 100% sure how long these guys will stick around. Price-wise, the Blood Angels also tend to be on the slightly cheaper end of the spectrum, like regular Space Marines, able to access quite a lot of deals, and for their unique units, their Combat Patrol is a pretty solid one. You get lots of Sanguinary Guard, and the Assault Intercessors could be fielded as Death Company, and it's probably the best way to get some upgrades throughs to field as that as well. If you're just starting the chapter, it's one that you could certainly conceivably get multiple of. For their rules and gameplay, again they use Oath of Moment and have the Core Codex and Supplement book system, as we mentioned, for the Dark Angels. Their playstyle generally tends to be pretty much all-out melee aggression. Lots of troops fielded that move really quite quickly with jump packs, both ones from the Core Codex and their unique options. They do have multiple very usable detachments, though the straightforward Liberator Assault Group getting +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge is a pretty powerful damage boost, and it's really quite straightforward to play if you just want to jump into the army and hit things really hard. You can still play it at least somewhat balanced though, and back it up with a bit of generic Space Marine heavy firepower. For their current power, they're kind of middling to sort of upper mid within Warhammer 40k. Certainly solidly scary, both with Sanguinary Guard and Jump Death Company backed up by their unique characters. And they have a new detachment called the Rage Cursed Onslaught, which is quite a fun one, and that already seems to be having some early success. It's got a bit of a Death Company slant with a bunch of hitting power. In any case, if you want to fight with some noble fallen angels bounding across the board on jump packs, the Blood Angels could be the ones for you. Next up for our Space Marines of different flavours, we've got the Space Wolves. These guys are the Nordic and Viking themed Space Marines from the planet of Fenris, all of them mighty heroes seeking to do great deeds and achieve their sagas. The army having the grim duty of being the Emperor's executioners during the Horus Heresy to sanction other Space Marines, including notably the Thousand Sons, and they remain completely happy to stand up against the wider Imperium when they believe that wrong is being done, and notably have clashed with the Inquisition and Grey Knights in more recent times to the point of open conflict. The homeworld of Fenris is a dramatic backdrop with plenty of ice and fire and a whole bunch of megafauna, which includes the mighty Thunderwolves, which some of their elite Wolf Guard tame and manage to ride into battle. The Battle Brothers have the Canis Helix, which does give the Space Wolves some wolf-like traits, including longer curved canines as they get older. In some cases though, this has been known to go too far and devolved them into the Savage Wolfen. They can be ferocious combatants, but are rather hard to keep in check on their more animalistic instincts. When the majority of the Space Wolves make war, it's generally to seek too close with the enemy and lay about them with power weapons and frost weapons. You see quite a lot of shields and axes being used for their fighters, and they certainly operate with very little regard to Rebute Gilliman's Codex Astartes, having some big great companies maintained, each of which have their own theme and personality. Their miniature range has Space Marines of a Viking and Nordic theme, plenty of runic armour, wolf pelts and wolf tail talismans and things, plenty of axes and shields, and some long bushy beards. They had a rather recent and really quite well received range refresh in mid-2025, and it feels like they've done rather well compared with some of the other Divergent chapters. They've got a medium-sized range of unique units, 2 troops, 1s and 2 elites, quite a lot of recently done characters, and still quite a lot in their Firstborn range as well, with Dreadnoughts, Wolfen, Thunderwolves and more. It does seem possible that they might get a few more releases next edition if Games Workshop is going to slowly phase those out. The troops for the army are the Brash Blood Claws and the more long-in-the-tooth Grey Hunters, more sort of slightly raw recruits and veteran Space Wolves respectively, and they're fairly similar to more standard Primaris troops but with just a few more subtle Space Wolf stylings. Their elites add quite a lot more theme to the army. There's Wolf Guard of different flavours as their elite guard. The Wolf Guard head takers fight with power weapons alongside some hunting wolves, and the Terminators have got some pretty good beards going on. You can field those with power weapons and storm shields or storm bolters as seen here, and are a pretty solidly powerful unit in game. Their recent character sculpts are particularly nice ones as well. There's Ayak Rockfist, the leader of the Wolf Guard, and Ragnar Blackmane, one of their Wolf Lords. Logan Grimnar is one of people's favourite miniatures for the range though, a rather imposing and brooding looking model as the Chapter Master, flanked by 2 wolves and looking down on his foe from that rocky outcrop. Perhaps some of their most slightly over-the-top wolfy units are their Firstborn ones though. Literally Space Marines riding wolves into battle is a slightly silly concept, but all very fun because of it. And the Wolfen miniatures has the Space Marines sort of slightly devolved into kind of Space Marine werewolf things, which do look a bit uncanny valley in my opinion. They do perhaps feel like one of the kits that I feel like Games Workshop might do better with a second attempt at. Price wise, again relatively good as Warhammer 40k goes as Space Marines. A fair few discount deals, most of their units aren't too bad for points on the board, and they do have quite a helpful combat patrol in their own right as well. Both getting Terminators, Wolfen, and the Blood Claws here feels like a win. A few units can maybe be a bit worse for points per dollars, say things like the Wolfguard Headtakers. Gameplay wise, again, it has really quite a lot of stuff from Codex Space Marines. They still get Oath of Moments to dunk a whole load of damage into one target per turn. The Space Wolves do have some other theming beyond that though. Each detachment that they have that's a unique themed one from them gets a fun mini quest in a saga to complete and some rewards for doing so. Their playstyle is usually fairly brutal melee might with lots of heroes thrown in. They often have a big emphasis on those in their armies over the years. The units in their Codex supplements all just move that little bit faster than other Space Marines as they charge into battle with a berserk fury, and perhaps compared with Blood Angels rushing in with a lot of speed, their on-foot approach does make them a little bit slower than that still, but they tend to be a bit more chunky and tanky, being able to take a punch fairly well with storm shields on a lot of their melee units. With their current power levels in Warhammer 40k, I'd say maybe a little bit sort of mid to lower mid. They're really not all that bad and quite well balanced. Top lists often tend to take the Chapter Master Logan Grimnar, who's a pretty powerful model with a good command point debuff. Beyond the Fell-Handed, it's a powerful Dreadnought who can generate some command points and is a big threat in his own right. Quite a lot of the Terminators generally enjoyed and a good mix of their other elites. Maybe the Gladius Task Force and the core Codex Space Marines seems to be the strongest on the tournament scene, though others like the Saga of the Beast Slayer can absolutely do fine as well. In any case, if you want to throw an angry force of Space Vikings at the enemy and carve out a great saga for Russ and the Allfather, then the Space Wolves might be for you. Next up for our Knightly Space Marines we have the Black Templars. Unlike the previous three, they're not a first founding legion but a successor chapter. These guys were the Imperial Fists as their founding legion, and they follow in the footsteps of Sigismund, the first captain of the Imperial Fist Legion. In the contemporary 40k setting, they've really diverged from the Imperial Fists in a very big way, and they act as a fleet-based chapter, constantly on crusade around the galaxy, basically stopping to resupply on friendly worlds as they go along, drawing resources and then hurtling themselves into the next fight. Their theming is of crusading knights, often using a lot of swords and having the Maltese cross as their heraldry. Otherwise for theming, they're particularly zealous and faithful compared with the majority of Space Marines, and are rather uncompromising and Puritan, very happy to purge those deemed unclean or tainted with Flamer, and perhaps being harsher for minor transgressions than other Space Marine chapters might be. In battle, they tend to place an emphasis of on-foot infantry led up by chaplains, bellowing out litanies to the Emperor as they charge into the foe and overcome yet more obstacles to his rule. For their miniature range, they've got a small but very nicely executed one in my opinion. Again, going down the knightly tropes of Space Marine armies, so a lot of sort of medieval style armour plates here, some robes and tabards and some symbols of faith, and they often fight with weapons chained to them as part of their Templar vows. They've got a small range of kits, they're really quite nice ones, and they had a fairly complete model range update in 2021, which basically redid the vast majority of things that they had in the past, and since then they've added a few more interesting, unique characters. Their two major squads are the Elite Sword Brethren Infantry and their Crusader squads. Their Crusader squads often takes the field in bigger numbers than other Space Marines out there, massing up in 20-man blocks, and having initiate fully trained Space Marines fight side by side by neophytes that don't have power armor yet. The Sword Brethren are the elite knights of the faction, fighting with all sorts of fun relic weapons, and both kits look really quite cool I think. Then to back them up, they've got a good number of characters. Here's High Marshal Helbrecht, the Chapter Master, having vanquished a greenskin, and Chief Chaplain Grimaldus exemplifies the chaplains for the army and is accompanied into battle by his relic bearer servitors. The Emperor's Champion is also a particular central model to the army, a chapter champion chosen on the eve of battle to bear the black sword and do the Emperor's name proud by laying low enemy heroes. And they do have quite a cast of generic characters to back them up. Here's a Crusade Ancient Banner Bearer and an Execrator Frontline Chaplain, both of those new miniatures for 2025, and their upgrade sprue I'd say is quite a nice one. I do quite like the actual physical manifestations of some of their chapter relics that they've had in the past. Price-wise, again, they're pretty similar to the rest of Space Marines, cheaper than most, and their unique units aren't really the worst in terms of points for the money that you spend, and in particular aren't too bad to get hold of at the moment, given that they come in the Combat Patrol, which I'd rate as quite a good one. Rules-wise, they change up the formula from standard Space Marines a bit, and instead of having Oath of Moments to destroy one key target, instead they get Templar Vows, I feel like it's maybe a slightly failed mechanic though, in that there's just one that's almost always better than the rest, and that allows them to take a +1 to wound in melee against things that you're wounding on a 4+ or worse, which just rounds them out really quite well against hard targets, and means that their Sword Brethren and Crusader squads can deal a lot of damage even to things like enemy tanks and monsters. It does mean that ranged warfare is going to be a bit less standout for the Templars, not using that and also not getting Oath of Moment here. In terms of playstyle, they're often melee-focused infantry supported by their heroes, perhaps with a more on-foot theme than some other chapters out there. Sometimes they might choose to make war with a huge horde of the Crusader squads, and otherwise might deploy by transports. They quite enjoy their Land Raider Crusaders that can make good use of the other Primaris transport, maybe some Sword Brethren jumping out of Impulsors or something. Their current power probably put them as sort of mid-tier to lower mid in Warhammer 40k currently. Their current most popular build tends to go around the Gladius Task Force, as Games Workshop really made the Templar Core Codex detachments a bit on the underpowered side for some reason. You might have the Emperor's Champion leading some Assault Intercessors, Castellans and Marshals joining a Sword Brethren unit for some massive damage output, and their version of the Repulsor Executioner is still some pretty devastating firepower, even if it went up in points slightly. I feel like it will be on the wish list to allow them to have a better themed detachment in their own right though. In any case, if you want a zealous horde of Space Marines cleansing the galaxy in the Emperor's name and happy painting a good amount of black power armor, the Black Templars could be for you. Then finally for the Divergent chapter Space Marines and for the Imperium, we have the Deathwatch. These guys are an unusual force within Warhammer 40k, not really a standard Space Marine chapter, but an organisation of Space Marines that supports the Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition, and they're the dedicated alien hunters. Their lore is that Space Marines from multiple chapters will serve rotations on the Deathwatch, so you have specialists fighting from all manner of different chapters out there, and they're generally fielded as kill teams, each guy having a specialist role within that, and then they generally tend to get equipped with some of the finest Imperial weaponry, including a lot of unique technology such as frag cannons, Infernus heavy bolters, or maybe Xenophase blades. They're perhaps better known for operating in small forces, maybe being as allies to other Imperial forces out there. They featured in Space Marine 2 early on, though if there's an absolute top-level Xenos threat, they might deploy en masse with the whole might of a Watch Fortress. They're an incredibly valuable resource though, and are often used as a precious weapon of last resort, maybe to slay a key commander or sabotage Xenos infrastructure in a way to stop an invasion or to get a huge advantage over the alien invaders. Deathwatch have typically been the most niche of the Divergent chapters that Games Workshop have developed. They didn't really have a lot of model support until relatively recently, having a small range release in 7th edition, though maybe with bad timing that came out very shortly before the release of the Primaris Space Marines, so everything scaled up slightly after. Their appearance is maybe fairly standard Primaris Space Marines with some unusual techie weapons. They're marked as Deathwatch by their black armour and the silver left shoulder pad where they bear the Litany Xena Mortis and the Inquisition symbol, and their other shoulder pad will denote the chapter that they fight with, and it can be quite a nice way to add some personality to the different squad members. Their model range is a very small one compared with the ones just mentioned though, basically having 2 characters, a Primaris kill team and a unique aircraft, and then a whole bunch of kill teams that they can field, essentially smash together combinations of different Primaris units, though it does mean that they have an interesting flavour. Their Primaris Marines have had a very recent update with Kill Team Deathwatch, each of those models able to switch between 2 different loadouts, and they're likely to be the mainstay of the army going into the future. Otherwise, they have a unique flyer in the Corvus Blackstar dropship. And here are their 2 unique characters in Watch Captain Artemis and the standard Watchmaster, fighting with a Custodian-style Guardian Spear. Beyond that, they also have an upgrade sprue, which can get you the Litany Xena Mortis shoulder pads. Then for a lot of their bigger and more interesting units, you basically have some options that generally combine 3 or 4 different Primaris units all into one squad. For example, to field the one in Gravis armor, you have heavy intercessors, plus some eradicators with melter rifles, plus some aggressors with flamestorm gauntlets perhaps, and that makes an Indomitor kill team which you field as one big squad. It does mean that if you wanted to put that together, it could be really quite an expensive one though, as you're basically paying for 3 different Space Marine units just to make one thing that you might want to field, even if that big unit is quite a points intensive one. As a result, if collecting them in maybe the more normal way and really focusing on their kill teams, it does mean they're likely to be one of the more expensive armies compared with most Space Marines out there. They still have access to all the Space Marine range and all the discount deals that they can get, so it's still not really too bad compared with most factions, and you can put a Deathwatch army on the table for not all that much money if you want to, though as mentioned those combined units can cost quite a lot. The pricing on their Primaris kill team isn't great for the amount of models and points that you get on the board. If you want every single model to have a Litany Xena Mortis shoulder pad, that would also be an additional expense, though you could potentially get some 3D printed ones maybe. and it doesn't help that you don't have a Deathwatch combat patrol box. I guess they do have the very small advantage in that you don't have to buy a second codex for them so far, given that they only have a digital index. Speaking of which, basically they use the rules out of Codex Space Marines and then they have a digital download document on Warhammer Community, and you also have the alternative way to play a sort of lesser version of them in Imperial Agents, and that would also be how you can put a kill team of them into another Imperial army. For their playstyle, it generally tends to be elite squads with mixed gear and mixed armor types, teleporting in and dealing some heavy damage with some close range shooting, lighting up the enemy with special issue ammunition, frag cannons and other stuff like that. Most armies tend to use their Blackspear detachment, which has mission tactics that'll give you 3 turns worth of interesting damage buffs. They still get Oath of Moment, and that Blackspear detachment has got some special issue ammo stratagems which can also be used to plug in and upgrade shooting. Currently in game, they are really quite a powerful army, with players in the faction managing to make them work rather well right now. Though compared with the vast majority of Warhammer 40k armies, they're one of the very least collected in the game, besides maybe Imperial Agents, and that's in no small part due to Games Workshop giving them a rather uncertain future. In 10th edition, Games Workshop kind of softly rolled them into the Imperial Agents Codex, which basically just massively limited the units that you'd be able to field for the Deathwatch, and will basically make them a shadow of their former selves, and only decided to kind of reverse course and release a digital rulebook for them, as they chose not to bother to release a 10th edition codex for them, which isn't really great news for seeing them as well supported for the future. I've no doubt you'll still be able to play with the miniatures in some form, and hopefully being able to field them as a full faction still. Until they're back with full codex status though, they just feel like one of the slightly more risky armies in Warhammer 40k, at least in terms of Games Workshop reinterpreting them. Even with a small chance of something major happening to them though, they're a really cool army and a really interesting way to explore Space Marine chapter interactions as well, with a bunch of different forces coming together to counter the Xenos threat. And if you want to play a rather cool specialist force of Space Marines, the Deathwatch might be for you. Moving on from the Imperium and into the realm of Chaos now, and first up we have the Chaos Space Marines. These guys basically represent the Space Marines that turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy, fought and were defeated under Horus Lupercal, fled to the Eye of Terror, but at no point have ever stopped being a major threat to the Imperium and the galaxy at large, and particularly with the fall of the Cadian Gate and the Cicatrix Maledictum spreading across the galaxy, the forces of Chaos are in ascendancy on a number of fronts. As with the Space Marines, they're genetically augmented super elite of humanity, equipped with power armor, bolter and chainsword, and much of the technology that the Loyalists can bring to bear, maybe with a bit more emphasis towards old tech and what was used during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy, but also rewarded by their demonic patrons, given unnatural gifts, mutations, and powers of the warp, and their ranks often bolstered by demons fighting alongside, or clanking demon engines, or covered in spikes. Also, like the Space Marines, their legions of warbands fighting their own distinct fighting styles, with a lot of their own flavour and personality. For their model range, their appearances are generally of Space Marines in spiky warped power armour, some of them maybe having mutations or extra adornments and kill markings, plenty of tattered robes and chains and skulls and things. They've got quite a lot of mortal followers and mutants to boost their ranks, and a good range of mechanical demon engine style models. They're a large and very well developed model range within Warhammer 40k, one of 40k's oldest and most established factions, and one of the great enemies of the setting. And over the past few editions or so, most of the core kits have been redone in somewhat recent history. There are still some notably older models around, things like Bikers and the Defiler maybe, though for the most part most of their plastics are really quite nice and good quality. The miniatures do tend to be quite busy ones though, with lots of trim and spikes and adornment, and that can mean that they're a bit more of a challenge to paint up. At time of recording, there isn't a whole bunch of support for the individual legions in Warhammer 40k as well. You might need to dip into the Horus Heresy range if you want unique themed stuff for those legions. Though from Games Workshop's recent teasers, that might be about to change, at least for some of them. This is talking for the core Chaos Codex that represents the Chaos Undivided forces. The ones that are dedicated to one specific god have got their own unique themes and model ranges. For a look at some of their miniatures, on the left we've got their standard Chaos Space Marine Legionaries, the basic troop of the army with your standard issue Space Marines in power armor. They have the choice of both bolters and chainswords and some other funky weapons and upgrades. Abaddon the Despoiler is one of the principal antagonists of Warhammer 40k, basically the War Master successor to Horus Lupercal, and he plans to lead his forces to bring the Imperium to its knees. And on the right there we have one of their demon engines, a scuttling Venom Crawler, well capable of laying waste to enemy infantry with its shooting and tendrils. The Might of Chaos and Ascendancy attracts lots of mortals to the cause. Here's a cultist mob with some improvised weapons. There's plenty of mutants in the army, such as these possessed warp talons, clawing their way in and out of reality and decimating infantry with lightning claws. There's a demon prince at the front here, what the Chaos Lords generally aspire to. trying to please the Dark Gods to the point where they ascend into Chaos Undying. And to back this all up, they have plenty of the standard Space Marine technology. Here's a Chaos Vindicator Siegebreaker tank. Legion support at time of recording isn't much currently. They do have a few things like the Night Lord's Kill Team though, which was particularly well received with some upgrade sprues. And here's one example of a Horus Heresy miniature in the Resident Alpha Legion Praetor. The Forge World range does tend to be very expensive if you go for that though. Price-wise, I'd say that the Chaos Space Marines are a fairly solid middle tier as Warhammer 40k goes. Not the very most expensive models in the setting, given that they're quite elite and you don't need so many of them, but then get far less discount deals versus the Loyalists. The Combat Patrol box I think is fairly useful with a good mix of units in it. And if you want to economise, some people go into the Horus Heresy range for the plastic side of things. You can get some armour marks like the Mark II ones with big 20-man box sets, and they can be really quite significantly cheaper versus the 40k kits, and kind of feel appropriate enough for certain Chaos Legions anyway, fighting with older marks of armour dating from the Great Crusade. In terms of gameplay, their rules are found in Codex Chaos Space Marines. The deity-specific legions have entirely separate codexes. There's no supplement books on the Chaos side of things, and their central army rule has the big damage dark packs, basically having to invoke the will of the Chaos Gods, and if they smile down on you, then you can get some damage boosts with either sustained or lethal hits to hit your target harder, though if you fail the leadership test, you might well take some casualties with your own models in return. Their playstyle generally tends to be at least fairly aggressive, with their profile skewed a bit more towards damage and defense with that special rule, and compared with the core Codex Space Marines, they maybe tend to be more melee slanted than ranged focused on the whole, though being adaptable Space Marines they certainly have options to do both of them. They've got a vast amount of detachments that can represent the different legions to a greater or lesser extent. They're one of the armies with the most options on this front. As well as the major legion themes, you've got things like the Soulforged Warpack, which represents Vashtor's demon engines as an army, if you do want to have a whole host of possessed machines to throw into the enemy and cause maximal carnage. Power-wise at the moment, they feel fairly middle tier and well balanced within Warhammer 40k, certainly capable of putting together some very scary army lists and doing well. And people do find some success with lots of different detachments, Renegade Raiders for fast-moving raiders that can hit objectives hard. You can do melee rush things with Creations of Bile, or maybe using the Pack-Bound Zealots, which often tend to do quite well on a vehicle-focused side of things, given the big boost that you can get to their damage output. Like the Space Marine chapters, the legions themselves are well worth paying some attention to here though. Most of them have lots of backstory going for them, given that they feature in the Horus Heresy series of novels, so are very well explored. As mentioned, they've currently got kind of limited miniature support, but can get some suitable aesthetic upgrades from Horus Heresy kits, and we might well see a few more Legion-specific miniatures released in the not-too-distant future. The Black Legion are the 40k version of the Sons of Horus, painting their armour black and following Abaddon the Despoiler, practical Black Crusaders who are thoroughly dedicated to bringing down the Imperium. And as well as Abaddon, they also have Harkon Worldclaimer as another unique character miniature for them. Their detachment is Veterans of the Long War, giving you a big damage boost against one unit, sort of like Traitor Oath of Moment. The Iron Warriors are the bitter siege experts of Perturabo, often liking ranged warfare and grim attrition tactics, often making good use of cultists as cannon fodder. They might have a good number of obliterators and big gun tanks in their ranks, and their themed detachment is the Fellhammer Siege Host, maybe a little bit less powerful than some of them, though just make your unit solidly harder to kill. The Night Lords are the depraved murderers who are the gene sons of Conrad Kurz. They make war with terror tactics, winged helms, lightning-cloaked armour, the flayed skin of their enemies, and often striking from the shadows with raptors in support. They have that nice kill team kit that we saw a second ago, so a bit better support than some of them in 40k. They've got the Dread Talons and Nightmare Hunt as their unique detachments, the Nightmare Hunt being the upgraded version and is the better of the two. It does have some seriously interesting stuff, though it's always very swingy as it really depends on opponents failing battle shocks at the right times, and any one unit might just pass the test. The Alpha Legion are the insidious infiltrators and saboteurs of Alpharius and Omegon. They're kind of like Chaos Special Forces, often infiltrating Imperial forces and donning disguises of other chapters and legions, assassinating characters or backstabbing people who thought they could trust them. They have many heads of the Hydra, and if you cut down one leader, one more will rise in its place. Deceptors are their unique detachment, which means that you can infiltrate loads of legionaries and cultists, though again is maybe one of the slightly weaker ones. It does mean that if you put loads of stuff at the front of the army, then they are probably going to get hit very hard turn one if the opponent goes first. The Wordbearers are the Sons of Lorgar, and they're the zealot evangelists of the Dark Gods, often covered in heretical texts and scripts. They want to convert the masses to the worship of the true powers, and make heavy use of demon possession, fusing their mortal flesh with the immortal warp stuff of chaos. Things like accursed cultists possess and the Dark Apostles fit their theme rather well. Their themed detachment is the Pack-Bound Zealots, which maybe feels like a little bit of a cop-out as the index one. It's still really quite a fun detachment though, marking different Chaos units to the different Chaos gods and getting different advantages due to it. There are plenty of other Chaos warbands out there beyond the core legions though. Huron Blackheart's more recent traitors and the Red Corsairs are a massive force within the galaxy, operating out of the Maelstrom. The creations of Bile are the followers of Fabius Bile, who are seeking to improve on the Emperor's work and better the Primaris project. They make war as a massive amount of augmented Space Marines charging towards the enemy, and there's loads more beyond that. Various warbands, plus forces like the Fallen Dark Angels, the Crimson Slaughter, the Purge, and many more. Finally, last but not least, we also have the followers of Vashtor as well, servants of the Chaos Demigod of the Forge, and masters of all things mechanical and mechanisms. They have that themed Soulforged Warpack, giving you some big damage boosts to those demon engines, though not without price. Overall, there's a vast amount of ways that you can customize and theme a Chaos army. So if you want to take up arms in the names of the true powers and oppose the Corpse Emperor, then the Chaos Space Marines might well be the army for you. Next up, we've got the Deity Chaos Legions, basically other flavours of Chaos Space Marines, the ones that fight in more notably different ways, each of them warped and twisted by their own Primarch and worship of one of the major ruinous powers. The World Eaters are followers of Khorne the Blood God, and as a result, exemplify battle rage and frontline close combat. Blood-mad Chaos Space Marines who charge forward with great chain axes, their signature unit being the Khorne Berserkers, whose size, strength and aggression are augmented by the Butcher's Nails, cybernetic implants going into their minds. Their shock assaults are legendary and some of the scariest out there in the galaxy, and their Primarch Angron is a very active threat in current Warhammer 40k, able to happily throw himself into any challenge with his customary wanton destruction, as when he is eventually banished, he is generally returned to real space very quickly after. Death is merely a setback for him. For the World Eaters model range, you basically get an army of angry guys with chain axes. They've got two of their main Space Marine unique infantry units in the Khorne Berserkers and the 8-bound, a fair few characters, their Primarch and some cultists, and then like the other Deity Chaos Legions, they can make use of a good number of more generic Chaos kit, things like transport vehicles and land raiders, and some support elements like some demon engines and gun tanks. Their range does feel like a fairly small one though, and many were a little disappointed not to get a more major second wave in 10th edition. There are quite a few obvious units that they could choose to release for them if they wanted to. Here are their Khorne Berserkers fighting with those mighty chain axes and pistols. They tend to fight in red armour with brass trim and lots of motifs of blood and skulls and chains and things. These guys can have a vast amount of attacks to put the smack down on enemy infantry in close combat. And here's some flavours of the rest of their range. We've got Lord Invocatus, a special character riding a Juggernaut who can bounce through the skies propelled by flame. An 8-bound on the bottom right there. A World Eater Marine possessed by a bunch of bloodletters, and suitably big, mighty and violent as a result. A massive demon engine in the Lord of Skulls at the back, and some very heavy fire support for the Servants of Khorne, and Demon Primarch Angron on the right, a rather spectacular muscle-bound centrepiece of a model, and a great brutish snarling demon. They also have some mortal hangers-on as well, with Jackals and Goremongers being their two flavours of cultists there. And then can use generic support things from the Chaos range, such as Chaos Predators or Defilers. Price-wise, again I'd say they're one of the cheaper armies to collect in Warhammer 40k as it goes. A fairly elite army, and their core troops choice in the Khorne Berserkers can get a fair few points on the board for the money. The 8-bound aren't too terrible on that front either, even if the plastic is a little low in those kits, and their Combat Patrol is quite a nice one, getting plenty of points on the board, and having a fun Demon Prince as a centrepiece. In game, they generally tend to play as a hyper-aggressive melee army, very little range support, and just throw themselves at the enemy with a massive amount of violence and enthusiasm. The units don't really tend to be all that tough, so they often might want to make some good use of terrain to shield from enemy firepower as they move up to get those chain axes to work. They do have different units for different roles though, and commanding them can still be a challenge, really knowing what to hit and what to risk when. Their core rule is the Blessings of Khorne. This one basically has you roll a bunch of dice at the start of each turn and plug them into various benefictions of the Blood God. He can amp up your damage in multiple different ways or provide other useful melee support like Fight on Death, and currently their army feels like a pretty well balanced one within Warhammer 40k currently. Most of their unique stuff fairly usable, though it would be nice to see a bit more help for Angron perhaps. Their top competitive lists at the moment generally tend to use the Berserker Warband. That gives you a lot of violence with extra strength and attacks on the charge, and go with a fair few Berserkers, 8-bound and Chaos Spawn to hit the enemy in a wave of bloodshed. If you want a fairly direct Warhammer 40k close combat army, the Brass and Red of the World Eaters might be the ones for you. For the Chaos Marine followers of Nurgle, we've got the Death Guard. They're a disease-ridden legion of Mortarion, sort of forced into an alliance with the God of Plagues when they were becalmed in the warp, and Mortarion was forced to do so to save his legion's lives. As a result though, the Death Guard were transformed into the Plague Marines, basically undying sacks of pestilence and filth, disease-ridden and rotting within their power armour, though with enemy blows and weapons it's very hard to bring them down, bullets and knives sinking into rotting flesh as the Plague Marine weathers the attacks and then comes back to hit back themselves. They tend to fight with grim attrition warfare, with heavy use of plague weapons and virulent bioarmaments, and might bring demon engines of Nurgle or ally with plague bearers or other greater demons of Nurgle themselves. The Legion's also particularly well known for its boarding actions, hard to tackle in space-bound combat, with lots of Terminators for that role, and they're organised into 7 great plague companies, each with their own agendas and their preferred style of making war. Their model range is a rather gloriously putrid one within Warhammer 40k, basically diseased space marines with plenty of tentacles, mutations, parasitic hangers-on, and battle damage. As a result, their models do tend to be rather busy and detailed, so might appeal to a few people a bit more than others perhaps. They've got lots of bioweapons in their army, and many of their elites are armed with scythes, which are their signature weapon. They tend to be painted in their drab green colour scheme. Compared with all the other deity legions, their model range is at least a relatively good one. Lots of unique units that date from 8th edition when they were one of the major overhauled factions then, and they can dig into a bunch of generic Chaos Space Marine options too. For some taste of their range, their battle line troops are the Plague Marines. They come with 7 models in the box set, which is handy for being the deity's holy number, but also means that you don't get quite as many of them for your money, which is a bit annoying. They've got a vast amount of war gear options and quite a complicated datasheet, and can hit quite hard when jumping out of a Rhino. Their elites are the Death Shroud Terminators. They can warp in from deep strike, and particularly with a Lord of Contagion can be a massive threat to just about anything with those scythes. They've got plenty of choices for demon engines, a slow and grinding Plague Burst Crawler, disease-ridden shells thundering down on the enemy's lines, or small engines like the Feated Bloat Drone or the Mephitic Blight Hauler, this one armed with missiles and multi-melters to take down enemy tanks and vehicles. Their legions might be accompanied by a great wave of Poxwalker zombies, recently deceased reanimated by Nurgle's blessing, clawing down the living with improvised weapons and adding them to their ranks. And their Demon Primarch Mortarion is a pretty spectacular centerpiece model. He was a very well received Primarch miniature, soaring aloft with his little attendant sensor bearers and his great scythe silence. Price-wise, again, they're probably somewhat middling for Warhammer 40k. They were vastly cheaper in 8th edition when they first released due to a bunch of discount sets. Those have gone away, but they still have an overall pretty strong offering, I think. They're quite an elite force that don't need as many models on the board as many, and in particular, after some nerfs to their codex with their points increasing, that set them a little bit further in that general direction. Their combat patrol is also a rather good one as well. Quite a nice mix with some of the base troops, their faction elites, a Rhino transport which is very handy for the Plague Marines, plus a Tallyman who is useful enough to count the plagues and farm up some command points. For their gameplay, they have some core mechanics in their troops having higher toughness characteristics than the vast majority of other Space Marines. It means that they're a bit harder to wound and take down, and many of their troops are armed with plague weapons, in this edition represented by lethal hits, which means that they have a small chance to just automatically wound anything. And it means that even super tough tanks and monsters aren't wholly immune to even your lowest troops. Their main faction mechanic are the Contagions of Nurgle though, and I think it's quite a fun idea with an expanding aura of disease and pestilence around your units as the games go on. If the enemy is within contagion range, then they get debuffs, their toughness characteristic gets worse, and they get one of your choice of 3 plagues, maybe making their armour worse as well, or maybe making them hit less well in close combat. Their playstyle has classically been a pretty slow and very durable army, able to weather a good amount of damage, and they have lots of stacking debuffs to make the enemy units just gradually die over time. They still do have some big elements of that, though in 10th edition they feel like they're harder hitting than they have been in the past, and do have some faster units like the Bloat Drones or Death Shroud Terminators that can deep strike onto the board. I say it still holds true to some extent, but they're not really an army of as much extremes as they might have been previously. They can do some solid ranged and close combat options, the Demon Engines provide good fire support, and Plague Marines and Death Shroud are rather excellent in close combat. Currently, again, they feel like they're a rather well-balanced army in Warhammer 40k, maybe tilting towards the stronger side of balanced, if anything. Army lists might have some Plague Marines deploying from Rhinos and causing mass damage, Death Shroud Terminators warping out of deep strike, and lay about the enemy with their scythes, and then backed up by some Demon Engine shooting, plus a few support pieces. They do have a fair few detachments that are pretty playable. In any case, if you want to collect an army of the disease-ridden Sons of Mortarion, then maybe the Death Guard could be the army for you. Next up, we've got the Sorceress Legion of Tzeentch and the Thousand Sons. Their legion was forbidden from using their psychic powers during the Horus Heresy, which Magnus thoroughly broke in a way that their Primarch Magnus the Red thoroughly broke by using psychic powers to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery, but also doing so in such a way that it thoroughly ruined the Emperor of Mankind's Webware project and potential saviour of humanity. The Emperor called the 8,000 Suns to be called account for that task, and after some chaos manipulation of the message, essentially the Space Wolves and Adeptus Custodes burned down Prospero, their homeworld, sending the 1,000 Suns thoroughly into the arms of the traitors. In the current 40k setting, Magnus is very much alive and active in the galaxy, the single greatest sorcerer that mankind has to worry about, and he commands a legion of sorcerers with the endless schemes of Tzeentch on the go, enacting great rituals to summon demons to real space, or blasting their foes apart with warp fire in battle. The non-Psycho Battle Brothers of the Thousand Sons Legion were less lucky. Tzeentch gave them bountiful mutations to the point where they thoroughly degraded and the Legion was falling apart. The Psycho Ahriman enacted a great rubric to turn them all to dust essentially, and now most of the Legion is silent automata, basically dusty power armor animated by magic and firing bolters that spit warp fire, and move as mere thralls and pawns of the sorcerers. Alongside these rubricae and sorcerers might flock great hordes of cultists and Zangors, or some mutant rabble to drown the enemy in chaff, and the army's got a lot of pseudo-Egyptian style theming, some pretty cool armour and styling, and were featured prominently in Space Marine 2 recently. Their miniatures are sort of medium age, pretty much all of them coming from their main faction launch around 2016ish. Several Space Marines with Egyptian style theming with quite a lot of trim, usually fighting in their blue and yellow colour scheme, and a whole bunch of Tzeentch icons and warpfire on the go. They can be an army that's perhaps particularly challenging to paint up, and perhaps even compared with some of the other Chaos Space Marine legions. Their range is kind of small to medium size. They've got their own cadre of unique units, Rubric Marines and Scarab Cult Terminators on the Space Marine side of things, and plenty of characters, and then they've got a big chunk of their range ported in from Age of Sigmar. Things like Zangors, the Mutalith Vortex Beast and friends, who weren't really made for Warhammer 40k in the first place, but certainly do well enough to fit the Tzeentchian cultist theme. Here are their two core kits with the Scarab Cult Terminators and the Rubric Marines. Both of these are squads of automata directed by the aspiring sorcerer leading the unit. The Terminators fight with their Prosperine Kopesh power weapons, and the Rubricae can either be armed with bolters or flame weapons and provide a fairly fearsome battle line. They have their Primarch Magnus the Red with his avian bird-like wings, Cyclopean eye and magic staff. They also have Ahriman, the guy responsible for the Rubricae, and a good number of other exalted sorcerer models. They have been a bit thin on the ground for releases in the recent history, getting their Sekitar robots with sort of Egyptian statue style things, and the Infernal Master who's a specialist psyker fighting with some demonic pacts. Then we've got all their mutants and cultists that were originally some Age of Sigmar models, the Zangors being sort of goat bird people, or very mutated by Tzeentch, and then the great tentacled mass that is the Mutalith Vortex Beast, a lodestone of psychic power, and can be a central engine of destruction for the army. Price-wise, the Thousand Sons are one of the cheaper armies to collect in Warhammer 40k, and perhaps even more so than some of the other Chaos Marines. In particular, their core kits with the Rubric Marines, Scarab Cult Terminators, and Exalted Sorcerers get you really quite a lot of points on the board for how much you spent. Plus, they also have a nice enough Combat Patrol box set, which gets you some Rubric Marines alongside a Demon Prince, and some Zangor Enlightened on their discs. It does mean that you can potentially build up to a full army of them a bit more cheaply than some, and a slightly condensed unit roster means that you might have just less to collect up before you sort of complete the unit offerings that you need, at least relative to some other armies with huge ranges. Gameplay-wise, the Thousand Sons tends to operate as a battle of Rubric Marines or Terminators heavily supported by their sorcerer characters, usually going really quite heavy on the character numbers here, and then around them you might have the Zangors operating as expendable units and support, maybe Magnus as a great big centerpiece model with loads of damage and buffs for your army, and they often tend to fight a bit more ranged than in close combat, particularly with close ranged warp fire. They generally have a reputation as often being one of the slightly more tricky armies to command in Warhammer 40k. I still say that that's the case at the moment. They've got a few big decisions that you can make with their Kabbalistic rituals, psychic powers, basically able to cast 4 spells, and it can be kind of important where they go and how much you try and play the risks for the best rewards for them, debuffing the enemies and making them easier to damage, and also moving around your units faster or just blasting the enemy with a bunch of mortal wounds. Overall in Warhammer 40k at the moment, after a few buffs, they feel sort of middling to stronger right now. I have a couple of good, fairly viable detachments with things like the Grand Coven and the Rubricae Phalanx, maybe more focusing around the Sorcerers and the Rubric and Scarabs respectively. A few of the more generic Chaos units aren't quite so focal to the army, but pretty much all their unique stuff is really quite usable in-game currently, including on the competitive scene, and despite a bit of a come down from their Codex launch power level, they're still a fearsome threat in-game. Overall, if you want a Sorcerer's Legion of Space Marines casting spells and manipulating the fates to serve the Dark Gods, the Egyptian-themed Thousand Sons might be for you. Finally, for the Deity Legions, we have the Emperor's Children, and these guys are the debauched and twisted Legion of Fulgrim, fallen to the temptations of Slaanesh, the Chaos, the Prince of Pleasure. and their Legion's character as prideful perfectionists and master duelists maybe sped them on their way to that. They're now given in to all sorts of hedonism and the desire to take in every sensation, often augmenting their senses to take in more of the battlefield din, or augmenting their bodies with surgical or demonic mutations to make them more perfect warriors. Their Legion is somewhat scattered and fragmented, lots of warbands fighting individually, and Fulgrim being particularly capricious, only turning up to help them from time to time. And when they make war, it's often in a kaleidoscope of colours, warriors trying to compete and outdo each other, and their signature noise marines blasting the enemy apart with sonic weaponry, and many of their warriors with their abilities dialed up to 11 with combat stims. Models-wise, they've had their recent release as a more mainstream Warhammer 40k faction. Until 2025, they were part of Core Codex Chaos Marines, and in general people were very pleased with the miniatures that came out. They're Chaos Marine models with all sorts of Slaneshi twists, like this Tormentor here. Lots of heraldry for their Dark Patron, speaker grills and sonic weapons for the Noise Marines, lots of dueling sabres and ornate finery for their leaders and characters, all paired with wide staring eyes and a fair bit of body horror. They typically fight in their pink or purple colour schemes, quite enjoying some offensively bright colours to add to the sensations. Their unique model range certainly isn't a particularly large one, and they did kind of notably miss out on a few options that plenty of the other deity legions can take. They can't field the Chaos Predators, for example, but the models they do have generally been very well received. For their core troops, they get the Tormentors and Infractors, the Tormentors fighting as peak space marines with bolters, the Infractors as hedonistic duelists rushing the enemy. Their elites have the flawless blades with the augmentations of Slanesh. They don't wish to surrender their perfect forms to seek demonic possession though. The Noise Marines are reinterpreted as slightly heavily armoured Havoc equivalents with their sonic blasters and weapons. They can decimate enemy infantry formations at close range. It has some generic characters such as the Lord Exultant and Lord Cacophonist, and perhaps most notably Demon Primarch Fulgrim in all his depraved glory, fighting with 4 weapons and some weird peelback skin and Slanesh iconography on his torso, and the much anticipated reimagination of Lucius the Eternal, the duelist character where if you beat and vanquish him, you'll slowly transfigure into him if you take any pride in your kill. The millennia in Slanesh's servitude have not been kind to him. Price-wise, again I declare them kind of middling as Warhammer 40k goes. Again, slightly elite compared with the majority of Warhammer 40k factions, and some of their units such as the Tormentors and Infractors and the Noise Marines can get quite a lot of points on the board for the money that you spend. Neither the single most expensive nor the single cheapest. Their Combat Patrol box set is useful enough if you want a lot of their flawless blades. In game, their playstyle tends to be really quite fast moving, not particularly tough but fairly hard hitting when they get there. Their army is far more skewed to close combat versus range choices, where they really only have the Noise Marines there, though they do have a very big role in the Codex due to that. And their core rule plays into their speed aspect, with Thrill Seekers allowing them to move fast. It means that your warriors can advance an extra d6 inches before they either shoot or charge, though with some interesting restrictions that they can't charge the same thing that they fell back from at the start of the turn, or can't attack the same thing that another unit has already attacked, as they'd find that too boring. In current gameplay, they maybe feel a little bit mid to lower mid currently. They're really not too significantly behind the power curve, and good players can absolutely make them work well in top tournaments. Most lists tend to be using their coterie of the Conceited detachment, where you make some pledges to Slanesh and then amp up their damage as the game goes on with kills. Due to their small model range, they don't really have a huge amount of variation in their lists, often having several squads worth of Infractors with the Lord Exultant, several squads of Noise Marines to deal some damage, and then the Winged Demon Prince tends to be fairly favoured as well. Pretty much all of their unique stuff is usable, though again it feels like Fulgrim could use a bit of help really compared with some. In any case, if you want to command an army of hedonistic, thrill-seeking Chaos Space Marines dedicated to their own desires and Slanesh, the Noise Marines with all their depravity and sonic weapons might be the choice for you. Next up for the Forces of Chaos, we have the Chaos Knights. These guys are the dark mirror of their Imperial brothers, fallen great nobles who have turned to the dark glory of the Chaos powers for one reason or another, either originally serving them since the Horus Heresy or having been corrupted since. They're an entire army built around titanic knight suits, with their pilots commanding enormous war machines, all covered in spikes and heraldry, and with a particular reputation for bringing doom, dread and despair. There are few armies that can be arrayed against the Imperium that are so renowned for causing terror and discord. Their households might fight for different reasons, either pledging themselves to Abaddon's cause and further the Black Crusade of the War Master, or they might be aligned with the Dark Mechanicum and have demon-possessed knights with all sorts of unnatural abilities. And as ever, they make war with heavy firepower and enormous brutal close combat weapons, and are often seen dueling their Imperial counterparts. Their model range is a relatively recent one within Warhammer 40k, an entire army of big stompy robots all covered in spikes, chains and kill markings, and definitely look a fair bit more unholy compared with their Imperial counterparts. Their model range is a bit of a limited one though. Their only unique miniatures that they don't share with the Imperial Knights are two main kits, one for their Abhorrent class Knights like this Knight Desecrator here, and one for their smaller war dogs. They are basically enough to carry the army though, building really quite a lot of different variants and different flavours of them, though a lot of their army being more represented by war gear choices as opposed to hugely different units. Beyond that though, you have the option to use several of the Loyalist pattern Knights for Chaos, and you can convert them suitably. You've got access to the Heresy era and Imperial Armour Knights, things like the Sarastas class that can move fast. The remaining resin ones will be very expensive though, and you can put some allied demons alongside, which is often pretty useful to have around, so you've got some more expendable troops that aren't in big fighty vehicles. It can mean there's a touch less variety than some armies out there in Warhammer 40k, but it's also really quite a clear and straightforward path to how you collect the army. Here are their main two kits. The Abhorrent class can make a good number of knights. This one's the Knight Abominant, a Psycho Knight, fighting with a great big whip coil and a massive Volkite weapon. It has a great Warpstorm aura around it, and terra-shaped birds rafting in its hull. And then on the right we have the smaller war dogs, dispatched as hunting hounds for their merciless masters, and they can fight in a number of different configurations. These ones are the ranged brigands, fighting with a demon breath spear and a Gatling cannon. Here are some of the examples they share with the Loyalists. The Dominus class is known as the Tyrant class for the Chaos, a great big walking gun turret and can be a central bastion to an army, and the Sarastas class Knights are tall and fast and hit rather hard. Here's the Knight Lancer with its shield and shock lance. Price wise, they're one of the cheaper armies out there in Warhammer 40k. You generally have at least a fair amount of points for the money that you spend on them, and maybe a little bit less after they cut some points costs for the big ones somewhat recently. They might not get discount deals, but it still remains pretty acceptable. Again, like the Imperial Knights though, with only a couple of primary kits, plus maybe one or two that are borrowed from the Imperials, it means that you can get an army on the go and have a completed collection a lot faster than some armies. Getting a few Knight chassis with some magnetised weapons, and then maybe acquiring other weapons from elsewhere, can get you a really long way to being able to field just about every single datasheet in the Codex. In-game, as with the Imperial Knights, they have a playstyle very different to most factions in 40k. They are an entire army of big chunky walkers with big guns and scary profiles, often fairly easy to use, but maybe meaning that they lack a little bit of subtlety compared with some of the other armies, and it means that there won't be a huge amount of variety within the different lists that you can make. It's just maybe more or less of the bigger guys versus the little guys. They certainly cut some striking figures on the tabletop though. The detachments can add a fair bit of theme in their own right. And then for their core rule, they have Harbingers of Dread, which is kind of a layered battleshock kind of rule for the faction. It can make your army harder to shoot, and then beyond that you get some progressive buffs and debuffs as the army goes through the game. Some of them helping the enemy unit fail battleshock more easily, and then getting some damage buffs against them when they do. The big knights can smash through terrain fairly unusually easily, and also has some auras that can help out the smaller war dogs. In game at the moment, they're sort of middling to slightly lower middling in power at the moment, and don't really feel like they're the army with the most internal balance in the world. Lots of their competitive lists tend to use the dual Gatling Despoiler Knights in the Infernal Lance, which just has some pretty devastating general purpose firepower. The Infernal Lance has some Dark Pact style things that allows you to get some sustained or lethal hits on your units. They can still be a very, very scary army, of course, and can still do well on the competitive scene, though in particular Knight armies often tend to be quite good at the sort of casual level of play on raw stats alone. And with big chunky walkers with lots of damage and defense, a lot of unprepared armies might not be able to handle them quite so well. In any case, if you want a big stompy army worth of heretical walkers to lay waste to the Imperium and their enemies across the tabletop, the Chaos Knights might be the army for you. Finally, for the Force of Chaos, we have the servants of the Dark Gods themselves, the Chaos Demons. These are the warp spawn that have broken out of the Imperium and flooded into real space, and generally all their units fall under one of the major thrall of the Ruinous Powers. Khorne, the god of murder and bloodlust, Tzeentch, the changer of ways with magical manipulation, Slaanesh, the prince of pleasure, pridefulness and debauchery, and Nurgle, the grandfather of disease, death, decay and despair. The Chaos Gods are constantly fighting amongst each other in the great game which often spills out into real space, and partly to gain the upper hand in this, they're often trying to corrupt mortals and sway them to their cause. Every Psyker can be at perilous risk of demon possession, or even unleashing a warp portal of demons to flood their world, often making war in enormous demon incursions that require the intervention of some like the Grey Knights to stop. When they fight, they tend to make war in close combat for many of their units, or blasting the enemies apart with gouts of magical warp fire, and demons are sort of pseudo-immortal, made out of demonic warp stuff that's hard to destroy in real space, and once vanquished their essence slowly reforms in the warp, as opposed to is truly destroys. The raw stuff of chaos itself is perhaps one of the most terrifying threats out there in Warhammer 40k. Miniatures wise, they're pretty well 4 40k miniature ranges rolled into one, each deity having their own mini army to act in their own thrall, with their own unique theming. Here's a Changecaster of Tzeentch, who's all about tentacle spellcasting, warp fire, and ever-changing mutations. They are a slightly mixed bag in terms of model recency and quality. A fair few miniatures have been redone in the not-so-very-distant past, including all the big greater demons. There are still some older models in their range, some of the chariots and maybe the lesser demons like the demonettes and bloodletters that may be showing their age a bit compared with some. They're an interesting faction in Warhammer 40k in that they also represent models playable in Age of Sigmar as well, and you've got overlap there with their deity-specific armies, things like the Maggotkin of Nurgle and the Hedon Knights of Slaanesh, where you can use the models in dual settings, though they tend to have different supports depending on where you play them. For some other flavours of their models and the different deities, Khorne's all about anger, bloodlust, and brass-wreathed armour. Here's a Blood Crusher, basically a bloodletter mounted on a Juggernaut. Slaanesh has their twisted demons of excess and debauchery, sinuous forms pairing some soft flesh with snapping claws, and Nurgle is all about disease and decay and despair, generally big bloated forms of their demons, oozing rot and pestilence. Great Unclean Ones utterly heedless of enemy damage, and to bring one down either in lore or in game can be really quite a challenge. They do have some undivided kits as well. Be'lakor is perhaps their closest thing to a faction commander model they can play in 40k. A demon prince with the power of all 4 chaos gods at once with his own brand of shadowy style. It's really quite a cool miniature, I think. There's the older Soul Grinder, which I guess would fall under Vashtor's remit, warped amalgamations of steel and demon. And I quite like the Demon Prince kit as well. You can dedicate them to the different ruinous powers, and this one's the same model that you used for the other traitor legions as well. Price-wise, they tend to be one of the more expensive armies to collect in Warhammer 40k. I'd say not one of the worst out there in the game, but certainly on the upper end. In particular, a lot of builds really reward their greater demons in-game right now, and they're quite expensive for the points on the board, and might not be the easiest to transport from place to place as well. It doesn't really help that they don't have a Combat Patrol box set as well, though if wanting to lessen the financial burden a bit, you could potentially look into some third-party 3D printed proxy models. There tends to be quite a lot of good stuff for sort of generic demons. In terms of gameplay, they have really quite a lot of their own style. Their current rules are in a digital download for Index Chaos Demons on Warhammer Community. Their playstyle will largely be melee focused for most of the deities. Tzeentch can do a bit more close range magical firepower, and their units will really vary depending on what deity you're fielding. Nurgle is slow and tanky, Khorne hits hard in close combat, Slaanesh is fast but not very tough, and Tzeentch can be annoying to take down with high saves and tends to fight at range more than melee. Their units have a lot of their own styling in the game. They have invulnerable saves as opposed to armor saves, so don't really care quite so much about cover, and loads of low AP attacks are probably going to be more of a threat to them as opposed to big hitting things with lots of armor penetration. Everything can deep strike if you want it to, and keep the opponent guessing on where it's going to be. In Demon Incursion, you can bounce things on and off the board, and their core rule is the Shadow of Chaos, basically giving you zones of control in your own deployment zone, and in the mid-board if you can take some objective markers, it can heal your units with Battle Shock and damage the enemy. And it's also important in Demon Incursion for accessing some boosting rules or getting their units into melee super easily. Lots of lists at the moment tend to lean on their greater demons pretty heavily for damage output, and if you wanted to field a force that isn't so much chaos undivided and go with the forces of one god, they each have their own themed attachment, where I feel like most of them at least add enough to be interesting and playable, though some a bit more than others. Currently they feel at least fairly strong in Warhammer 40k, perhaps helped out a bit by the buffs to the Lords of Change recently. They have quite a lot of raw power and can be a challenge to handle maybe on more casual tables. They're perhaps a bit less standout at the top tier of competitive currently, maybe having some slight aspects similar to Imperial Knights, where focusing on just a few enormous models can mean that you have less chance for subtlety. I would say though that this army comes with a fair few caveats, maybe in a similar sort of style to the Imperial Agents. At the moment, Games Workshop is very much supporting the Chaos Demons army, and you can play them as a full faction in-game, but Games Workshop's indicated that there's a good chance they might well be reinterpreting them in a big way next edition, as they chose not to release a full codex for them in 10th edition, and instead just brought out all their content via digital downloads. They didn't give them a Combat Patrol box set, and they haven't had a new model released this edition. There's at least some suspicion that they might go the way of Age of Sigmar now that all the Deity Chaos Legions exist, where they split up the demons and put them into the Deity Codexes, rather than fighting as one unified Chaos force. Obviously we don't 100% know what's going to happen in 11th edition. I'm absolutely certain that demon models will still be playable in Warhammer 40k, they're a big part of the lore. Though maybe if you do really want to jump into Chaos Demons right now, I might be more tempted to focus on the core units of one deity, as opposed to collecting a massive mix of all of them quite as much. Obviously we won't know what the future really brings though, until Games Workshop unleashes it. In any case though, they're still a really cool faction, and a big part of the Warhammer 40k lore, so if you want to feel the will of the ruinous powers made manifest, and lead a demon incursion into real space, the Chaos Demons might be the army for you. Moving on though, we come to the ranks of the Xenos armies, and starting out we've got 40k Space Elves in the Aeldari. The Aeldari are also known as the Craftworld Eldar or as Ynnari, and are basically a dying race of technologically advanced space elves, believed to be created by the Old Ones in the War of Heaven to fight against the Necrons, and rose to prominence in a galaxy-spanning empire. Thinking none could challenge them, the empire declined and fell into depravity, and this was the catalyst for the birthing of the Chaos God Slaanesh, tearing the heart out of their empire and feasting on the Eldar's souls, some of the only survivors being those that fled on Craftworlds, so far from the epicenter of their empire when the calamity occurred. Since then, the story of the Aeldari has generally been that of survival. Their race plies the void on great starship havens called Craftworlds. Some fight to restore the empire to their former glory, some fight for mere survival or to counter the great enemy and destroy the agents of chaos wherever they might manifest, and some place hope that their new god of the dead will save them. When they make war such their low numbers that even their citizens must take up arms. For an Aeldari though, even a standard, slightly untrained civilian can be a master warrior compared with many of the races out there. They're the ones that dedicate their lives to the path of the warrior and become aspect warriors of the war god Cain can fight on another level, exemplifying his different ways of fighting, from the immolation of the fire dragons to the acrobatic grace of the swooping hawks. When they attack the enemy, it's generally as part of a brightly coloured war host, moving at breakneck speed. Their battle psychers can conjure mighty magics, jet bikes and grav tanks might scream overhead, picking the enemy apart with advanced weaponry, and impervious wraithbone constructs that house the spirits of their dead ancestors stride to war once more, providing an indomitable battle line that all but the heaviest weapons are useless against. For their model range, the Eldar are a race of space elves with some high-tech gear and a whole bunch of their own style and runes. Their standard warriors tend to have plenty of gemstones and a spirit stone to stop their soul from being devoured by Slaanesh on death, and they usually tend to be painted in vibrant colours. They've got really quite a large miniature range, and they're one of Warhammer 40k's oldest and most established factions out there, and Games Workshop has finally got around to properly refreshing it for the modern age. Lots of their Aspect Warrior and Phoenix Lord kits had previously hailed from before the turn of the millennium, and it's been quite nice to see them being redone both last edition and more recently in 2025. Here are a few of their models. Their Guardian Defenders are their standard citizen soldiers. They're fighting alongside a grav platform here bearing some heavy weapons. Windrider jet bikes are a rather signature unit of the Craftworlds, capable of moving at breakneck speed, and only Eldar pilots have the reactions to pilot them, and their war hosts are often guided to battle by their seers. Here's a Farseer Skyrunner. He can cast the runes and divine the fate of the army, seeing what plays are needed to bring their forced victory, and guiding their enemies to a horrible future. The Aspect Warriors all have their own theming. On the left here we have the Howling Banshees, fighting with power swords to lay low enemy infantry, and Banshee masks that can amplify their war screams to cow even the bravest of foes. And then there's Dark Reapers on the right, bringing Cain as the aspect of death. In the direst of circumstances, a Craftworld will sacrifice one of their own to awaken the Avatar, a great flame-wreathed body of the God of War themselves, emboldening the Craftworld's warriors and bringing molten death to their enemies with the Wailing Doom. They have Phoenix Lords as the exemplars and commanders of their aspects, several of which were redone very nicely recently, with Azamon of the Dire Avengers here and Fugan of the Fire Dragons. The Wraith hosts are another major theme of the army, impervious Wraith constructs, guided into battle by their psychers, loath as the Eldar are to disturb the dead, and I think that their vehicles are quite nice, sleek and fast grav tanks, some of them a bit older than others like this Falcon grav tank, though I think that even the older ones hold up really quite well to more modern standards for the most part. Pricing wise, the Aeldari are likely to be a more expensive faction than most, though not necessarily the most expensive in Warhammer 40k. It can depend at least a fair bit on unit choice. Some of their Wraith constructs tend to be better points per the money, and while their Aspect Warriors are fairly expensive for the amount of plastic that you get, they also tend to be fairly elite in game as well. so aren't quite as spectacularly low in terms of the amount of points that you get on the board for the money compared with certain armies like, say, Admech. Their Combat Patrol box set feels like a fairly helpful start as well, with a bunch of Dire Avengers, Warp Spiders, and Wraithguard. In-game, their rules are represented in Codex Aeldari, and with a big established range, they do have plenty of ways that they could play, either focusing on their Aspect Warriors, going heavy on Grav Tanks or Jet Bikes, or fielding a Wraith Host. For the majority of their units, though, they're generally unified by a fairly fast and hard-hitting army that doesn't tend to be all that durable, though usually has a whole bunch of sneaky tricks and interesting manoeuvres to basically get the first strike on the enemy, and potentially, even if they do, then to fade away out of sight again and stop the opponent from hitting them back. With that being their whole theming, they're often one of the stronger factions in Warhammer 40k, as clever manoeuvres like this might often give you some of the most powerful tools to gain advantages in games. Their core rule at the moment is Battle Focus, and that gives you really quite a lot of movement tricks. You get another resource to manage alongside your command points, and you can essentially plug them into a bunch of different abilities, either to react to the opponent, or potentially just to get boosted movement exactly where you need it. And it can add another layer of complexity to an army that already requires some command finesse, and as a result are probably going to be one of the slightly harder armies to command to the top level of what they're capable of. Recently they have suffered a few big nerfs to their army, and maybe are looking a little bit weaker than they were as a result. It's maybe a touch less clear what might take over as the next big thing and top build. Previously it was quite a lot of small squad Aspect Warriors with some Phoenix Lords. I suspect there might still be an element of that, but maybe there'll be some room for some experimentation. Hopefully they don't fall off too hard. In any case, if you want to collect an army of Warhammer 40k's doomed space elves and bring some powerful weapons to bear commanded by warriors who are aspects of a war god, then the Aeldari might be for you. Within the Aeldari, I think it's worth mentioning a couple of their sub-themes, which are kind of mini-armies in their own right. Harlequins used to be a major faction within Warhammer 40k, and now are maybe a bit more of a major sub-faction, but still have their own model range, and you can play them as a primarily standalone army. These guys are basically the enigmatic servants of Segarak, the Eldar Laughing God. They hide deep in the Webway, protect the Black Library, and travel freely both between the Craft Worlds and the Drukhari. They aren't exactly very numerous and might often fight as more sort of small warbands attached to other forces called troops, but in their lore they're some of the very most powerful fighters in the Warhammer 40k setting. Battle skill and reactions to a ridiculous extent where they have no difference between war and performance. Their troops capable of dancing through enemy formations, dealing death at every blow with all manner of exotic monofilament weapons and fancy power swords, killing an entire squad's worth of enemy elites before escaping unscathed onto the back of a transport. Their model range has a small one that came out in 2015, 3 main plastic kits and a few characters. They were a standalone faction in Warhammer 40k for a time. Now they're not so much, but Games Workshop does pay them a bit more attention than some. Their miniatures are basically performer-style Aeldari, and bear in mind that if you want to replicate the box art and all those fancy check designs, you're going to need a steady hand and a lot of patience. Price-wise, they're kind of similar to Aeldari overall. On the right, you've got their core troops, standard Harlequin warriors dancing through the enemy protected by hollow fields and fighting behind their enigmatic masks. They've got a couple of flavours of jet bikes and skimmers, the Skyweaver jet bikes with 2 riders on them, fighting in close combat with Zephyr Glaives or throwing Star Blasts to take down their enemies. There's the sinister Death Jester who might be lurking in the background, dispensing pain with his Shrieker cannon. They've got a skimmer vehicle that can double up as a transport or a ranged fire support choice. They can be fielded in a few ways in Warhammer 40k. If you're collecting them as the primary army, you'll be fielding them probably in the Serpent's Brood detachment now, likely to have a good number of small units of troops fighting out of their Starweaver transports, or some big units of jet bikes that can hit the enemy and run away again. Again, they tend to move fast, hit the enemy units fairly hard at close range, and then try and escape afterwards. If you did want to field them in a more allied capacity to other Aeldari armies though, you can just slot their units in alongside them. They tend to be a little on the underpowered side though if done that way. And the Drukhari have the Reaper's Wager as one of their stronger detachments, and that has some supporting rules for fielding some Harlequins there, though again they tend to be fielded in a bit more of a limited capacity. If fielding them by themselves, they are going to be one of the weaker factions in the game, as Games Workshop don't really balance around them as being a standalone faction, so I would bear that in mind that you're certainly not guaranteed to have them be super strong when you're playing. It could be more of a challenge. In any case though, if you want to field an army of enigmatic Aeldari performers, a Mask of Harlequins could be the choice for you. Finally, for the core Aeldari Codex, at least until we get Rangers of Corsairs released, we've got the Ynnari, and these are the faction within the Eldar that worship Ynyad, the god of the dead, believing the rise of their death god will be the only way to conquer and counter Slaanesh. They fight with death magic and get empowered by the souls of Aeldari dying around them, so become a yet more serious threat as they take casualties. Their storyline was maybe an interesting one for Aeldari lore progression from Games Workshop, though they didn't really wind up doing too much with it after they revived Guilliman. and the core of them are now seen as a bit more of a fringe faction of extremists, the actions of their prophet of reign having turned a good number of their former allies against them. These basically fighters are mainly Craftworld's force, who can field a few Drukhari units allied alongside, and then for their unique units they have the Triumvirate of Ynniad, the avatar of the god of the dead, the Incarn, Evrain their main faction commander and prophet, and the Vizarch her bodyguard and commander. They certainly feel like a bit more of a sub-range, and are mainly held together by characters, though I feel like a lot of people find the idea of fielding both Craftworld and Drukhari stuff next to each other an interesting one. In any case, their main rules are found within Codex Aeldari, and they do have some interesting rules for supporting them with the Devoted of Ynniad detachment, though it was considered far weaker post-nerf, and it does lock out some things such as, say, taking those Phoenix Lords. A lot of the Drukhari units can't be fielded as well, it's only a selection that are within the Aeldari Codex. They have tended to be a faction that has weirdly got powerful in Warhammer 40k in terms of gameplay several times over now. Currently though, they were hit with some rather punitive nerfs to the point where they're just not really considered quite so strong on the competitive scene. Maybe in the future they'll rise again though. In any case, if you want to collect a slightly more niche and fringe army of the Aeldari and have the option to combine some Craftworld kits with some Drukhari ones, then the Ynnari could be an interesting choice. Speaking of the Drukhari, the fiendish Dark Eldar are the Aeldari that you really don't want to be fighting against, as there's far worse fates than death out there in the 41st millennium. The Drukhari reside in their nightmare city of Comera in the Webway, and they're basically the Aeldari from the dark days before the fall, the ones that survived the wrath of Slaanesh, and they've continued to be an absolute blight on the galaxy since then, using the twisted science of the homunculi flesh crafting to essentially cheat death and be reborn with new bodies, and their primary reason for warfare tends to be to steal and enslave, striking out from the webway to lay waste to a planet, often very happy to pick on defenseless targets where the population might not be able to fight back, and they physically feed off the pain and souls of their captives, relishing and sustained by their misery and suffering, and their entire society built around causing pain upon others. As a result, luckless Imperial worlds pray that they don't take you alive. When they make war, it's often under the cover of darkness and fight from the back of skimmer transports that move at breakneck speed, punching through enemy battle tanks and fortifications with dark light beams before disgorging their warriors into the midst of the enemy to cause pain and suffering with every blow. Several of their weapons not even necessarily the most efficient or dangerous they could be if they can inflict more torture. Within their forces, they have distinct sub-factions, the Kabbalite gangs and overall rulers of Comera, the witch cultists that fight in the gladiatorial arenas, and they have various hierarchies and organisations within them, and then the disturbing flesh creations of the homunculus covens, abominations built out of the flesh of captives and propelled into the battle to capture and enslave more fresh meat. Miniatures-wise, the Drukhari have a medium-sized range within Warhammer 40k. The models, like their Craftworld brethren, tend to be slender and agile-looking, though these guys are often covered in spikes and trophy racks and sinister adornments, and are all rather malign and dangerous-looking. They can be a bit more of a challenge to transport than some armies in Warhammer 40k, particularly their skimmers with several fragile bits poking off them. Most of their miniature range dates from around 2010, which would make them as one of Warhammer 40k's older factions on the whole, but I must say, compared with the vast majority of armies, I feel like most of their figures hold up rather well considering that. Quite good designs that have stood the test of time. Their main issue facing them at the moment, though, is that they've had a lot of units that have been classics since the faction first came about, that have recently gone away from the Codex. They don't have models on sale, and they can only be played with the rules from Warhammer Legends, so we're really hoping that some of those come back maybe next edition with a major release wave for the faction. They're certainly due one. Looking through some of their miniatures, and on the left we have the Kabbalite warriors, perhaps some of the core troops of the Drukhari. They're armed with poison splinter weapons that can shred enemy infantry. Central to the faction are their skimmer transports. Here on the right we have a Venom conveying their warriors to the front, and maybe a smaller transport for more elite forces, and then behind that there's a Ravager gun platform, sacrificing transport capacity for some dark light weapons or heavy hitting disintegrators. For the witch cults, they're often fighting with gladiatorial weapons, plenty of snares, whips and various blades. They have Lilith Hesperax to lead them into battle, the ultimate champion of the arena, and only needing 2 simple knives and her own wits to take down the enemy. And they fight alongside Reaver jet bikes and Helions that also tend to be crewed by witches. Then we have the Homunculi Covens, the mad scientists of the Drukhari, making their macabre creations. Their base troops are the Raks, often armed with all sorts of disturbing torturous tools, and then they have the bigger pain engines such as this Talos pain engine here, armed with some macro scalpels and some ranged firepower. There's plenty more support units beyond that, such as the Winged Scourges bringing some heavy weapons to the fight, or the Elite Guard that are the Incubi armed with their claves, and other things like shadowy mandrakes and their aircraft hurtling along above. Price-wise, they feel like an army that's sort of medium to worse as Warhammer 40k goes. Again, not really the priciest army in the game, but certainly not the cheapest either. Perhaps one advantage that they have are that quite a lot of their kits are older, and as a result, I feel like if Games Workshop released them now, they'd be significantly more expensive, and probably not get you any more plastic or points on the board. On the other hand, though, their Combat Patrol box set is a pretty limited one. It's only helpful if you want a Homunculus Covens element to the army. It's nowhere near as general purpose as the previous one. You might be able to find the more recently released Real Space Raiders as a better alternative to that, with several of their units not really costing all that many points in game though. They're certainly not on the cheaper side of 40k armies. In game, their core army mechanic is a fairly thematic one. They gain power from pain, so if the opponents either have units destroyed or fail battle shock tests, then the Drukhari gain pain tokens, and they can plug those into abilities depending on the unit's datasheet to do things like give them extra damage, or allow them to advance and charge or return to reserves or something. And again, that can mean that they're a slightly more complex army to manage. You have to weigh up really quite a lot of options with different abilities and select the right one that's going to further your aims the best. Perhaps quite a lot to keep in your head on top of playing the mission and the detachment buffs and stratagems that you've got going on. For their general playstyle, like the Craftworld Eldar, they move very, very fast, tend to hit really quite hard, but most units are very fragile when they're hit back. There's lots of toughness 3 profiles that aren't so very hard to take down with volume fire. Many armies make pretty heavy use of their skimmer transport, lots of squads loaded up in Raiders and Venoms, and between their speed and a bit more durability, that can usually guarantee that you get the first strike on the enemy rather than the other way around. And they do have detachments that can theme heavily to either their Cabals, Cults or Covens if you want to go heavy. Currently, the Witch Cult one, the Spectacle of Spite, is considered a really strong one. Their combat drugs and other melee support giving them some pretty big power at cutting through the enemy at extreme speed. For a more balanced detachment, a lot of people quite enjoy the Reaper's Wager one, which is on paper the allied Harlequin one, though it does a very good job even if you don't take any Harlequins whatsoever. In any case, if you want to collect one of 40k's most downright evil factions and inflicts misery and pain on the enemy with poison weapons and torturing tools born on the back of skimmer transports and extreme speed, the Drukhari might be for you. Next up, we've perhaps got one of the most truly alien races of Warhammer 40k in the Tyranids. These are the great devouring swarms that originate from the depths beyond the galaxy and have made war on the races of the galaxy that they see as little more than biomass in enormous great big high fleet invasions, striking at the galaxy from multiple different angles. The individual Tyranids are more sort of beasts and channels of the will of the mysterious hive mind, guiding their forces in a great planet-wide invasion, starting with infiltrating organisms to sow discord and weed out cracks in the enemy's defences, and then the invasion begins in earnest, gargoyles swooping down from the sky, and armoured organisms like Carnifexes challenging the enemy's main defences. Resistance is crushed, the hive mind can deploy fancier assets if necessary, and then the process of devouring the world goes on. Feeder organisms eating all the biomass on the planet and reabsorbing it into the hive fleet, ready to move on to their next meal. During this whole process, they make war with myriads of ever-evolving bioforms, often symbiotic living weapons and ammunition being carried by the main tyrannic organism. They might fire living projectiles that explode on contact, blast enemies with spores or toxins, or monstrous creatures might rip enemy tanks asunder with vast claws. The Tyranids also have a mighty psychic presence as well, blocking out the warp for other users and channeling the power of the hive mind into great warp lances to deal direct damage to the enemy. The different hive fleets also have their own customary ways of making war as well. The hammer blow that was Hive Fleet Behemoth, the insidious infiltrating tendrils of Kraken, and the highly adaptable and sheer enormity that is Leviathan, striking the galaxy from multiple angles. Models-wise, the Tyranids have the appearance of some semi-insectoid aliens, with some carapaces overshadowing muscles, claws and wings. Their weapons are equally fleshy constructs, grown for that purpose alone, and can look pretty striking when they're on the tabletop. They're generally considered one of the armies that's fairly easy to paint up and get looking good. If you can make both the flesh and the carapace tones look rather nice, then you're going to be a long way to a completed army with just 2 colours. They've got a pretty enormous range as one of Warhammer 40k's older and most established factions, miniatures to field pretty much every battlefield role. And of course they had an absolutely enormous update with the launch of 10th edition, lots of shiny plastic releases, with plenty of the classic things that really needed updates finally getting them, and lots of people were drawn to the faction both with that and also their major featuring in the Space Marine 2 game, truly showing the horrors of a Tyranid invasion at first hand. For a few flavours of the tools at the hive mind's disposal, at the front here we have some Tyranid termagants, basically the equivalent of more normal infantry with small arms. They'll typically be fielded in vast numbers with huge assault waves to overwhelm the enemy and deplete their ammunition. On the right, we've got the Tyranid warriors, fighting elites capable of going toe-to-toe with Space Marines and able to command lesser organisms with synaptic control. On the left, we've got a Psychophage, a medium-sized monster and feeder beast, often preferring to go after the flesh of warp-sensitive individuals. And at the back, we have a Neurotyrant, essentially a Hive Tyrant Zoanthrope, a terrifying psychic presence to cow the enemy, and of course blast them apart with torrents of warp energy. Much of the heavy lifting and big damage dealing is done by enormous monstrous creatures. The Tyrannofex is basically a Tyranid living heavy battle tank, capable of carrying the Rupture Cannon, one of the foremost anti-tank guns that the swarms can bring to bear. Harpies can swoop above, dishing out firepower and dropping spore mines, and Venomthropes can shroud the Tyranid advance under vast clouds of spores. Price-wise, the Tyranids tend to be on the lower end of Warhammer 40k at the moment, particularly helped out by featuring as the antagonist faction of 10th edition, and that's meant that they've got some discount deals with the starter sets out there. The standard Warhammer 40k starter sets having a particularly good deal for the amount of plastic that you get for the money, and that's even the case if you completely discount the Space Marines, which of course you wouldn't really. That can be used to get a core of a good few units on the board, though outside that things admittedly do get a bit more expensive. A bit less standout beyond discount deals. Given their popularity, you might find a fair few more of them going second hand though. For gameplay, the Tyranids have some slightly unusual core rules. In the past, they've generally been rewarded for having the lesser organisms stick close to the synaptic control of the greater ones, and in 10th that's represented by being far easier to pass battleshock tests within synapse range, and it now also buffs the strength of them in melee too. Otherwise, once per game they can unleash the Shadow in the Warp, a great wave of psychic horror, and that can force the enemy to fail a few battleshock tests, potentially disrupting certain units and messing with scoring, though it's always going to be an unreliable mechanic given how all or nothing battleshock tends to be. For their playstyle, there's a fair few ways that Tyranids can get things done. In general though, a fairly balanced mix of a few of their cheap and efficient lone operatives and infiltration things, backed up by some cheap swarms to swoop onto objectives with lots of OC, and then backed up by some monsters for some of the heaviest damage dealing. Maybe some Exocrines or Tyrannofexes for fire support, perhaps some close combat beasts like the Haruspex or a Norn Emissary. They can go heavy on the different elements of their army though. You can field their Vanguard organisms en masse in the Vanguard Onslaught. You can have a more balanced playstyle in the Invasion Fleet, and a particularly interesting one recently is their Subterranean Assault. That one focuses around their burrowing units like Raveners and Trigons, and it can be particularly powerful for delivering the other Tyranid units to battle to deal damage against the exact right enemies at the right time, and it's particularly good for getting short charges with melee units. Currently they feel like a pretty middling and well balanced army as Warhammer 40k goes. Most of the strong armies tend to be using either Invasion Fleet or Subterranean Assault right now, but within those there's quite a lot of flexibility with units being used. In any case, if you want to command a vast swarm of aliens swooping in from the scary darkness of the void beyond and fight with an ever-evolving threat that no foe can ever truly overcome for long, the Tyranids might be for you. Before the invasion fleets of the Tyranids even reach a planet though, they might sow discord with a Genestealer Cult, and Genestealer Cults are essentially an insidious faction that infiltrates Imperial worlds for the most part, spreading a plan generations in the making to corrupt their populace, weave their way into the highest echelons of power, to eventually rise up and cast down their Imperial oppressors, and ensure that their oncoming star deities have no resistance to the taking of the world. To do this, a Patriarch typically makes landfall upon a planet, a sophisticated psychic bug that genetically and mentally corrupts the desperate masses of humanity, building a dark religious cult around it, a cult that birthed many generations of hybrids of different sort of specialties and battlefield roles, keeping their presence absolutely secret with the ultimate devoutness until the day of ascension is at hand. When it comes, the mutants burst from their shadows. Friends and allies that the Imperium thought would be on their side suddenly might turn their guns upon their former comrades, and Genestealer Cults often make great use of looted Imperial technology and mining gear, mining lasers and rock saws, making great weapons to be able to cut down enemy space marines and war machines. They fight with guerrilla warfare tactics, opportunistic equipment, and the strength of their mutations with claws and great big muscle-bound aberrants. For their model range, the Genestealer Cults are at least a relatively newish Warhammer 40k army, having had some miniatures in the distant past, being absent for a very long time, then returning in 7th edition. They've got a kind of small to medium-sized range of 40k miniatures, with the main aesthetic being a sort of unholy fusion of mutated humans with big craniums, employing various mining weapons and power tools to destroy the enemy. I feel like they're one of the armies where the aesthetic more notably divides people into people that do like them or don't so much, and maybe does bother me just a little bit that they aren't a bit more varied as per their lore. On paper they do feel like there would be an army that would be very adaptable as to the location that spawned them. You could convert to other themes beyond mining gear if you wanted to though. Within their range it does feel like they've got a rather overabundance of character models as one criticism. They tend to have more support characters than they need, though plenty of them could potentially be kit bashed if you don't particularly like the Games Workshop sculpt for them. For some examples of their range, some of their base human hybrids are the neophytes, standard line infantry armed with some small arms are ready to crawl out of the shadows and summon more to their units with their cult icons. The acolytes are the more heavily mutated melee versions, slightly bigger mutants armed with knives, pistols and some heavy rock weapons to cut through tough enemy armour. And of course they have a model for the Patriarch presiding over all of this, the Alpha Bog being a sinister figure residing in the background, though when the time is right to strike he can be a mighty threat in his own right. For other units that they have in their arsenal, there's plenty of support characters. The gun-toting Kellamorph with the 3 pistols is a fun one. There's the Reductor Saboteur with her explosives. Aberrants are the muscle-bound mutants that can deal with enemy tougher stuff with some big hitting power picks and hammers, and they've got some vehicle support as well. Atalan Jackal Bikers and the Goliath mining vehicles either deployed as trucks to transport the troops around, or rock grinders that can mount a great big drill dozer blade and potentially cut through and deal some big damage to some infantry and enemy tanks. Price-wise, the Genestealer Cults are certainly one of the more expensive armies in Warhammer 40k, though in 10th edition with their cult ambush regenerating units and things, they might be a bit less so compared with sometimes in 40k's past. Getting multiple uses out of the same models does lessen the burden at least a tiny bit. Even with that, their units are often kind of low value to field on the board, and are mostly expendable mutants of one sort or another, only a few like the Aberrants being a bit better with the price per money ratio. Their combat patrol can be helpful enough, particularly having multiple copies of the Acolyte box that also builds the Metamorphs is useful. The Jackals and Bridge Runners are pretty useful to have, though I must admit the previous combat patrol was significantly better and got you really quite a lot of units. Gameplay feels like it's often been one of the most interesting aspects of the Genestealer Cult army. Their whole guerrilla warfare thing has just often had them operating in really unusual ways, and often the Genestealer Cult player might be the one more in control of what happens in the game. Opponents fighting a bit more reactively to various threats jumping out of the shadows with them, and then maybe doing so all over again once they're dead. Most of their infantry units can deep strike, so get the jump on the enemy that way, and then they have their signature special rule called Cult Ambush. This means that once certain units die, you can basically recycle them. You have a certain amount of resurgence points, and it might mean that you can send a second wave of the same models later in the game, which could be useful both for dealing damage or doing objective things. Their guerrilla warfare sort of playstyle often means that you get the jump on the enemy, but as a result, the Genestealer Cult stat lines don't tend to be hugely efficient in their own right. They really need multiple layers of buffs to make them truly hit hard. Some detachments are very capable of doing that though. Currently power-wise, they're relatively well balanced versus the rest of 40k's factions, and quite nice to see that they have several viable detachments, maybe the melee-focused Biosanctic Brood Surge being the single most popular currently, though others like the allied Tyranids with their final day, putting in some lone operatives into the army, or the Host of Ascension, they're also pretty interesting as well. They do have the option to ally in some Imperial Guard units as well, though unfortunately it's only with one badly supported allied detachment. Just in general, they do tend to be another one of the armies that's got a bit of a reputation for being a higher skill army to play in 40k. You're really going to have to think about unit placement and getting every single advantage out of each one of the datasheets, as just trying to meet the enemy toe-to-toe with damage profiles isn't going to work. In any case, if you want to lead an uprising in the name of the Four-Armed Emperor and cast down the Imperial oppressors with some mutated freaks with mining weapons, the Genestealer Cult might be the army for you. Next up, we have 40k's race of space dwarves with the Leagues of Votann. These are another very recent faction to be re-added to the game. They were previously the squats in Warhammer 40k's distant past. They were removed from the game for a long time, though returned as the Votann, a race of cloned AI-augmented space dwarves governed over by their ancestor cores. The Leagues have several of their strongholds in the galactic core and are basically constantly seeking to expand their prospects and acquire more resources and power. They produce biological kin as clones for various different purposes in their society, and also mechanical AI iron kin that have equal standing in their society. They most often tend to make war to either acquire resources or defend their strongholds against oncoming threats, and maybe a little bit more likely to work with other more friendly Xenos races when it absolutely suits them, though only if it's firmly in their interest against a common foe. When they make war, it's often with Imperial-style technology, split from their tech in distant past, so they have their own versions of bolters, autocannons and conversion beamers, many of which their scientists have made some significant upgrades to in the absence of the Imperium's suppression of innovation. Their warriors tend to be very well supplied and clad in fine void armour. For their miniatures, their general overall aesthetic is maybe a little bit generic sci-fi spacesuits and moon buggies, but then blends a little with some fancy dwarven totems and inlays and things. Within the army they have a few distinct sub-themes, including Hernkin scout troopers and Chthonian mining guilds who basically operate as sort of like berserkers with the army. eschewing void armor but having lots of augmented bionics. The robot Iron King are another fun sub-theme as well, with their characteristic domed helmets like this guy doing the loading on this gun here. After 2 major releases, they've got a fairly medium-sized miniature range now. They've only been around since late 2022, but they had another fairly major release in 10th edition with a bunch of new units and characters. I would say that maybe their models have just met slightly muted reception within Warhammer 40k. Plenty of people love their space dwarves, of course, but I feel like maybe outside of Buri Agneson, you've very rarely seen people ever being super hyped about any one of their model releases and their appearance. Going through their kits, maybe one of my slight favourites are the standard Harlequin warriors. Your standard sci-fi dwarves in spacesuits. They can be armed either with bolters or iron blasters and plenty of special weapons and choices within the squad. They've got their, or rather, egg-shaped iron hair Hearthguard, essentially the equivalent of Votann Terminators, though their weapon profiles have maybe a bit more punch at range versus melee than you might expect. For their vehicles, they have this sort of big wheel moon buggy kind of vibe. The Sagittor is their light transport. The Hecaton Land Fortress is a great big indomitable battle tank with some heavy armour, and mount some high-tech, hard-hitting weaponry on the top, like this conversion beamer. For their leaders, their standard battlefield commander is the Carl, directing his force with ruthless efficiency. Or with a bit more classic dwarven styling, we've got a Grimnir, who is the faction's psyker, a living ancestor capable of warding off enemy damage and attacking the enemy with his psychic powers. Here are their Hernkin Jaeger scouts and their Pioneer bikers, having a different sort of fun theme with their space dwarves in the big trench coats. And then here are a few of their more recent model releases for 10th edition, a trio of characters with a battlefield scientist with some high tech, a Memnir strategist who's doing some big thinking, who's an Iron King guy, and Buri Agneson, a rather ornately armoured space dwarf with a Dark Star glaive, and he's a dedicated Tyranid hunter, as you can tell by the trophies he's taken. Price-wise, I'd put them at the somewhat medium to expensive side of things within Warhammer 40k. Again, maybe not at the very top of the tree in terms of price and expense, though at the same time not really all that far off. In 9th edition, they were previously really not too bad to put on the table, though it was partly due to their slightly wild judgment token rules that wind up having the average guy cost quite a lot of points. That's a bit later the case in 10th edition, and most of their units kind of land in the range of being not terrible points for the money, but not great either. Their combat patrol box is interesting enough for a core of infantry for the army though, and does have a reasonable discount. You could get multiple. In terms of gameplay, their general theme tends to be a fairly short-range shooting and melee damage dealer army. Their base infantry might be a little bit slower compared with some, and they have little in the way of things like advance and charge. They do tend to offset this with at least fairly powerful damage output, and the defense of most of their units is at least okay. They have quite high toughness values, and for their special rule they have a system of yield points, basically bonuses to taking objectives in the early game, re-rolling against units that are on them, and then bonuses charging them, switching to damage buffs for your units that are on objectives later on, and you can also plug those yield points into certain other things like stratagems. Being already objective focused and eyes on the prize seems to fit well enough with the law of acquisition. For in-game power, they're pretty well mid-tier and well balanced overall. They haven't really been either standout powerful nor standout weak since the codex dropped, and relative to most other factions out there in Warhammer 40k, the majority of their units are really quite playable right now, and a few of the ones that have played a little less got some buffs recently. The majority of lists usually tend to go for a couple of Hecaton Land Fortresses though to add some big firepower, and the Brockier Thunderkin have some damage output that's hard to ignore. And they do have several pretty playable detachments. The Needguard Oathband is quite a general purpose one, the Bramfast one's nice with transports, and the Hearthband is pretty potent since they updated the rules for it, with a slight focus around their exo-armoured Hearthguard. In any case, if you want to field a race of clone sci-fi dwarves, laying about the enemy with some potent weapons and technology to advance their prospects, then the Leagues of Votann might be for you. Moving on to some slightly less civilized Xenos, next up we have the Orks. Well established elsewhere in fantasy settings, 40k's flavour of Orks are brutish techno-barbarian greenskins, essentially living fungi that spread across planets like plagues, and ever looking forward to the next scrap, loving melee combat in particular, setting about the enemy with their axes known as choppers, and bigger fancier things like power claws. Most Orks like nothing more than a good scrap against a powerful foe. Guns are enjoyed too, though maybe slightly lesser. They tend to be loud and powerful, though really not very accurate. When greenskin numbers reach a critical mass, they might spark a great war, a holy war migration, where a powerful charismatic war boss sets them forth to stomp the whole galaxy flat, and that's usually very bad news for any of 40k's other factions in the vicinity, as a ridiculous amount of hyper-aggressive greenskins descend upon their world. They'll be supported by their mech boys who can cobble together some scrap creations, making all manner of lethal and dangerous technology to unleash upon the foe, and various boys have their other flavours and specialisations, speed freaks racing their way towards the enemy on bikes and buggies, or very tactical commandos being surprisingly strategic for Orks, and beast snagger boys unleash squigs of all shapes and sizes upon the foe. as they seek down to bring down the biggest prey imaginable. Orks are really quite fun and kind of refreshing in their way that they just don't really take the whole horror of Warhammer 40k that seriously, and as a result it's often kind of fun to see their interactions with the other factions out there. For their model range, you're generally going to have some brutish and violent looking orcs, equipped with weapons that look like they've been welded together with some heavy-handed enthusiasm. The miniatures tend to be pretty fun and violent looking, though not really all super uniform, and within the army they've got plenty of flavours of infantry, various themes like the speed freaks with their buggies and bikes and things, and plenty of big and stompy walkers tend to fill the ranks as well, built by the mechs. As another one of Warhammer 40k's staple factions, they've got a pretty big model range. Lots of themes and tropes of it been added to the army over the years and generally being kept up with. I feel like the majority of their range isn't in the worst shape in the world, relatively nice quality plastics for a fair few of them. The Weird Boy could do with a new model given that he's still in resin, and then beyond that there's quite a few kits that are hailing from 5th edition, and they're probably next on the agenda for updates, maybe ones like the Looters and Burners, Warbikes or Knob Squad. They're widely believed to be the antagonist faction of 11th edition Warhammer 40k, which would certainly be good news for them if so, as it would lead to them getting a huge amount of new models. On the right here we have their basic boys, their primary troops choice, and generally make war in some pretty big numbers. This one, the newer kit, which does have some pretty fun proportions and quite nice individual sculpts, though is a bit irritating in its inflexibility, as you can't arm the entire squad with either shooters or choppers. For other examples of what the greenskins can offer, on the left we have the Squighog boys, man-stalk cavalry, mounted on steeds that are as surly and bad tempered as they are. On the back right we've got the Gorkanauts, one of the larger orky scrap creations, this one an effigy to Gork, the orc deity who's more brutal than cunning, very happy to solve problems in melee with a great big power claw. On the top left they've got a shock drum dragster. They had an interesting release of a big range of various Mad Max style buggers that you can have a big variety of in your army if you'd like to. At the front we've got a big mech with a shock attack gun, a rather insane creation that blasts diminutive snotlings into the enemy, often literally teleporting them inside the armour and bodies of enemy troops, and the surprisingly disciplined Storm Boys who combine some military discipline along with rocket packs to allow them to hurtle through the air. Gretchen are another pretty fun factor within the Orc range, a diminutive and cowardly Orc slave race, basically doing the bidding of their rather violent masters, occasionally coached into battle by runt herds to do all the worst jobs, though even they might be able to get a taste of some stompy power when they're wired into a killer can. They can be some quite fun miniatures to paint up, and the Orc clans have quite a big feature for their character. There's various different flavours of greenskin that might make war in their very different ways, with the light-fingered Death Skull stealing things to cobble together with scrap creations, the Snakebites that want the more traditional old ways and don't really like too much technology, to the piratical freebooters who fight under the captains of their kill cruisers. Price-wise, Orcs are one of the most expensive armies out there in Warhammer 40k, at least if you go almost entirely by Games Workshop kits, though there's plenty of options that you could use to either use some third-party proxies or do a bit of converting. I'd say maybe more so than just about any other army. People like to make some good use of plastic art and other 40k bits and orky things and create some war machines for them, and they can both be an interesting way to get something unique on the tabletop and also save some money versus the official kits. Their combat patrol is useful enough, though only really if you want a major element of beast snaggers within your army. I feel like they're nice enough models though, and they're certainly effective enough in game, but it depends on the force that you're going for. In terms of gameplay, one of the most fun things is their War Core special rule, and this one basically has your war boss let out a deafening battle cry, surging your forces towards the enemy with a massive amount of violence and enthusiasm, so everything gets to advance and charge and hit far harder in melee, and then also be harder to kill in return. All the units basically go into rage mode and are vastly strong for their points cost on that turn, though a bit more muted outside of that. And just in general for the themes of their datasheets, they tend to be a bit less elite than most armies out there, at least compared with their equivalents, and Orcs like close combat a fair bit more than ranged warfare, so usually they'll hit on a 3+ in close combat, but just a measly 5 when they're shooting things at range. Firepower is usually made up out of enthusiasm and quantity, as opposed to being crack shots or anything. Usually just in general, their playstyle tends to be a hyper-aggressive one, piling lots of pressure on the foe, and particularly in the turn of the war. Lots of units rushing forwards to inflict violence upon the enemy's battle line, though often with slightly lighter armour. Even if they've got good toughness values, Orcs might not be the toughest to take out in return. Overall power-wise, they feel fairly middling or well-balanced right now. They certainly can be a scary threat on the table with a good list played well. Maybe some of the most powerful things at the moment are a Warhorde list with use of Ghazghkull to lead a big mob of boys. That's a pretty enormous threat right there. And then some other scary stuff loaded up in transports. And definitely with some Gretchen support, as they're rather good at farming up the command points on some objectives. They do have other detachments that can support their other army archetypes, though I feel like they're maybe a little bit of a letdown on the power side of things. Green Tide and some Mega Knobs with Bully Boys maybe being some better examples. In any case, if you wanted to lead a force of hyper-violent greenskins and stomped the galaxy flat with some good use of squigs and looted technology, then the Orks might be the army for you. Next up, we have the young and upstart Xenos race that is the Tau, a species known for their radical technological development, pushing out on all sides against Imperial space and the various other horrors of Warhammer 40k, and constantly seek to innovate and overcome to beat their foes. In their armory, they've got lots of scary weapons. In particular, they're rather well known for their manga-style battlesuits. They have some Far Eastern themes and styling in their army. They operate in a caste system with the Fire caste being the warriors, the Earth caste doing the building and technology work, the Water caste as the diplomats, and the Air caste to man the fleet, all ruled over by the rather shadowy guidance of the Ethereals. When they take to the battlefield, it's usually with crackling pulse rifles and railguns, sleek grav tanks, and well-equipped fire warriors, and they fight in mobile hunter cadres with the disciplines of Montkar as the fast-striking killing blow, or the patient hunter Cao Yon approach to ambush the enemy and give ground provided you're getting the kill. The Tau Empire are also well known for their breakaway faction in the Farside enclaves as well, the Renegade Commander having set up his own string of fortified worlds across the Damocles Gulf, much to the vexation of the Ethereals for their wayward son. For the Tau's model range, they're super futuristic. They're basically a race of grey-blue skinned Xenos with hooves, and their weapons look all rather advanced, sleek battlesuits, bristling with weapon systems and a good number of hard points for different support things, scanner packs and shield generators. They have grav tanks and fire warriors in their army, and a couple of sub-ranges to represent the alien auxiliaries that fight alongside their empire in the Kroot and the Vespers. As 40k armies go, they're a medium to larger miniature range at the moment, being around since at least relatively early in Warhammer 40k's past. Their kits often tend to have a good amount of war gear choices with different ways that you can equip them, and have hovering drones to accompany them on flight stands. Several of their models are maybe kind of medium-aged in Warhammer 40k, though I feel like the ones that are a little older tend to hold up really quite well due to their aesthetic. For examples of their forces, some of their best known troops are their on-foot fire warriors, fighting with pulse rifles that pack an enormous punch for a regular infantry small arm. Their very best known forces are their crisis battlesuits though, descending from on high in a daring strike maybe from the back of a Manta gunship, and they can be equipped with specialist weapons for their battlefield role, say Stormforged fusion blasters to decimate enemy tanks and armour, or the chattering burst cannons of the Star Scythes. They have stealth suits in their army, including the big specialist Ghost Skill, which is capable of dishing out heavy firepower while remaining near unseen, and heavy fire support on a number of different chassis, including the Hammerhead gunship. This one particularly feared amongst Imperial tank commanders for its railgun and armament with enough stopping power to fire its projectile all the way through an enemy vehicle and out the other side. They have some battlesuit commanders on offer as well, the Renegade Commander Farsight with his Dawnblade, heavily hinted to be a Chaos artifact, which might be how he's resisting the will of the Ethereals, and Commander Shadowsun, the current Commander-in-Chief of the Firecast, making war with her twin fusion blasters and modified stealth suit. Their alien auxiliary allies might use a few elements of similar looking technology, though broadly have very different looks and feels to them. The biggest and most developed of them are the Kroot mercenaries with the avian bird people and their Krootox riders, and then there's the insectoid Vespers, striking from the skies with their neutron blasters. Price-wise, at least in their current form, Tau tend to be one of the most expensive armies to collect in Warhammer 40k. It feels like it didn't really used to be the case, but quite a lot of the units just don't really cost all that many points to field in-game currently. Maybe not really quite having quite as much devastating firepower per unit as they had before at some points. Some things maybe aren't terrible, such as the Hammerhead gunships, and their combat patrol is alright as well. Though even so, they're still vying for one of the most expensive factions in the game, only really contested by some. For their gameplay, their core rule is for the greater good, and this exemplifies Tau fire discipline, their units supporting and spotting for each other, maybe putting a marker-like bead on the enemy target, and then another unit vaporizes it, and it means their units can coordinate to shoot straighter, and certain units can have extra advantages such as the stealth suits, allowing you some rerolls to hit and wounds. The Tau Empire's playstyle is really quite different to the majority of the other armies in Warhammer 40k, almost exclusively focusing on ranged warfare over melee, some of their only melee-capable units being the Krootox Rampagers, whereas most of the other things are either gunline or close-range firepower, some having some pretty good rewards for being brave and getting close though, say Fusion Blasters or the Fire Warrior Breachers. Typically their units are fairly mobile but not really super tough to return damage being taken on them, and typically armies might deploy with some skirmishing units to take the midboard and hold up the enemy, and then have to make some intelligent decisions between balancing their units being exposed and taking damage versus getting the lines of sight they need to bring their firepower to bear. For their current in-game power, they're maybe kind of medium to perhaps slightly lower medium currently, still overall rather balanced, and they can absolutely be a threat to top tournaments and things. They perhaps just felt like they had a few more nerfs than buffs recently between the stealth suit changes and riptides going up a bit. In general though, Tau have to be ranked amongst one of Warhammer 40k's most impressively balanced factions out there, with just about all detachments being usable and most of them being really quite strong as well, and the same with the vast majority of their datasheets. Most of the normal ones can be used well in the right detachments. In any case, if you want to collect an army of battlesuit pilots and high-tech dynamic Xenos pushing their empire forward for the greater good, the Tau Empire might be for you. Within the Tau, I'll probably just mention that you can also collect Kroot as a fairly standalone army at the moment. As mentioned, these carnivorous avian birdmen often act as auxiliaries to the Tau, but do fight their own battles in their own right as well, hailing from their homeworld of Peck, where they have long and bitter rivalry with the Orks and generally tend to favour ambush and hunting tactics, using the larger fauna of their homeworld to do some heavy lifting against the toughest stuff out there. They're a bit more of an option to collect as a more mainstream army recently after Games Workshop released a small range for them. In the past they've had a bit of support from a Forge World range that is now defunct, but they basically got a big overhaul of their core units in 10th edition, plus some new additions like the Kroot Rampagers and Lone Spear. And they do have quite a powerful detachment in the Kroot hunting pack that can really make them work as a fairly central part of the army, giving them some fairly major buffs to damage and defence. Even having said that, they're still a bit on the limited side, and often might need to work with the Tau. A few hammerhead railguns certainly might not go amiss in their lists. I would bear in mind though that again, if you wanted to collect them solo, they'd certainly be one of the most expensive forces in Warhammer 40k. They don't have any discount deals on offer, and pretty much all their units have low amounts of points for the amount of money that is spent. Still kind of cool that you can collect Kroot as a fairly primary army and put them on the tabletop, and they're just not terrible at the moment. That wasn't really the case before the 10th edition update to them. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the Necrons. These are 40k's race of deathless robot skeletons, an ancient Xenos species from time long before most of the races of the galaxy existed, and have basically gone into hibernation and stasis on great tomb worlds to sleep out the millennia, and only now are rising from their long slumber to reclaim the Empire and take out their vengeance on the usurpers who have happened to be setting up shop on their worlds. Long ago, the Necrons swapped their flesh for living metal bodies gifted to them by their star god Votann, though in doing so it cost them their souls, most of their race little more than shambling automata, and only their overlords, leaders and other higher-up figures having more sense of personality. When they make war, they're perhaps one of Warhammer 40k's most dangerous foes to fight against. Technology-wise, they're playing on another level versus the majority of races out there in the galaxy. Much of their disturbing technology so advanced it's difficult to determine it from magic. Molecule shredding, Gauss weapons, quantum shielding and units phased part out of existence, and implacable hover vehicles that move forward propelled by forces unknown, like inescapable death itself. Phalanxes of Necron warriors march forward out of the portals of monoliths, even their small arms being incredibly lethal to any that get in the way, and their living metal bodies often mean that even warriors laid low by enemy firepower might just rise up and reform to take to the battle once again, particularly if a Necron overlord's around to gesture towards them with a resurrection orb. They have a great number of different units to support them into the fight, one major theme in their army being the destroyers, Necrons hating all living beings and augmenting themselves into living weapons to better reap the red harvest on the lesser races and wipe out all life in the galaxy. Model-wise, the Necrons are basically futuristic robo-skeletons with some advanced guns, and they certainly have a fair amount of space Egyptian styling going on with scarabs and obelisks and things. As well as the destroyers, they've got other subclasses within their range, such as the Canoptech Automata as the constructs that do the will of the Cryptex, and some other supporting units like the flesh-crazed flayed ones, and the fragments of living gods that are Catan now harnessed to do their will. Their models have really quite a lot of metallic details, and as a result, if you want them to be, they can be really quite quick to paint up if you'd like to. You can get a lot of work done with some washes and dry brushes. And their model range is really quite a big and fairly recently updated one, having a pretty cool amount of new content that came out in 9th edition, which drew a lot of people to collect the faction. For some flavours of their units, here we have some Necron warriors marching forward as a great phalanx, armed with their Gauss Reapers to lay low the enemy infantry. Some Canoptech Scarab swarms scuttle in front of them. On the right we've got an Overlord, perhaps the most generic character to lead the army. He's got a powerful Void Scythe, and that Resurrection Orb can get your units reanimating at double speed. The Necron Cryptex are responsible for their various flavours of technology. This one's a Chronomancer with power over time itself. And here on the right we have some of their Canoptech creations. These ones some Wraiths, capable of phasing in and out of reality, are resilient to enemy damage as a result, and their claws and particle weapons all ready to tear apart any interlopers onto the tomb worlds. For their vehicles, perhaps none are more iconic than the mighty Monolith, a great space pyramid with its Eternity Gate allowing you to march more phalanxes of Necrons through it, and other vehicles might look rickety to first sight, though invariably are protected with quantum shields, which make a whole load of the attacks that would have struck the vehicle basically vanish as if they never were. The Void Dragon is perhaps one of the coolest models of the faction. I really like the way that they redid the C'tan, held aloft on crackling lightning and eldritch horror with some pixelated sort of effects going on. And the Scorpet destroyers with their augmented hyperphase reap blades are another fun one. Elite destroyer infantry that are well capable of dealing with their equivalents in enemy armies. Price-wise, they're neither really standout expensive nor standout cheap for Warhammer 40k. They're certainly a lot more expensive than they used to be when they first came out in 9th edition and had more discount deals. Their combat patrol is a useful one for some discount on these models, though admittedly while the model mix is quite good, it doesn't have the hugest discount compared with some of the others. For their gameplay, one of the core features of Necrons is that they reanimate. Basically, living metal repairs both downed warriors and injured vehicles, and as a result, each of their units will slowly regrow wounds each of your command phases until they reach full health once again. This can be quite punishing if the opponent isn't able to fully take out your unit. It basically means that you can undo a lot of their hard work, and several of their biggest combos often revolve around buffing that to the maximum, making units that are super tough, and then having them reanimate in a really big way to ping back to full health if the opponent can't kill them. For their playstyle, various things can work for them, though usually some manner of big durability combo and the ability to reanimate it often makes an appearance depending on what's strong. Other units certainly don't necessarily all go in for the same thing though. There's pretty powerful firepower that you can get out of Doomsday Arcs at the moment, or maybe some Locust Heavy Destroyers. They've got plenty of melee units like those Scorpet Destroyers or the durable front line of the Canoptet Wraiths. They might be supported by some big individual threats such as the C'tan or the Silent King, enormous points cost but lots of damage. There's lots of different ways that they can get things done, have plenty of things to fill most battlefield roles, maybe do tend to be skewed to a little bit slower, ponderous and more durable compared with most 40k armies though as a whole. For their current power, they feel like they're in a rather good spot within Warhammer 40k, fairly well balanced, maybe mid to upper mid in power. Generally, some of the best armies either tend to go for the Starshatter arsenal that supports the Silent King and Doomsday Arcs well, or Awakened Dynasty that can help out with characters, with Zarek the Silent King, the Canoptet Wraiths, and Doomsday Arcs all being really popular choices, plus a bit of reanimation support to whatever big tough thing that you've got. In any case, if you want to collect an army of deathless robot skeletons, fighting with unsettling technology and the ability to laugh off a huge amount of enemy firepower, then the Necrons might be the ones for you. And with the Xenos species all talked through now, that just about brings us to the end of this one. Obviously a bit of an enormous task to talk through all the races of Warhammer 40k and even give 5 minutes or so to each one of them. If you'd like to find out a bit more about any of them, feel free to search Auspex Tactics and How to Start X Faction on YouTube. I've done a start collecting video for just about everything mentioned here and talk about your chosen faction in a bit more depth. If you'd like to see more like this though, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I do tend to make Warhammer 40k videos just about every day, most of them a little bit shorter than this one though. That's about it for this one, though before I go, I'll just cycle back to Titan's Terrain in the video sponsor and talk briefly about their pop-up cardboard terrain offering once more. As mentioned in the earlier segment, it is a terrain set that's got some more obvious advantages and disadvantages compared with most. The main unique selling point for it is that it's just very easy to store and transport due to the folding system. Pretty much no other terrain set folds away this small this easily. It's also far cheaper than Games Workshop terrain, though you could say that of lots of other things, and it doesn't need any painting or assembly, being ready to go immediately. For a few potential disadvantages, it is a bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF given it's made of cardboard. You do need to take a little bit more care of it, and due to needing to fold flat, it means that you can't really bear a lot of weight on the tops of ruins, so you might not be able to put models there so much, and the grid layout can be one downside as well, potentially giving you a touch less flexibility with where buildings are placed. You can get some variety by rotating the buildings though, and it might not be the worst just to supplement with maybe an extra ruin wall or two to make sure that you break up some firing lines. It doesn't really make Tauren and improved layouts, though I've heard good anecdotes it's usable enough for some straightforward terrain for casual 40k games. For their different options that they have, they've got this Forgotten Furnace Chaos Foundry style one, lots of glowing runes and burnt out factories here. And then their other major one is their Shattered Hive, a more standard ruined city with some bombed out buildings and armoured containers, maybe a more typical 40k battlefield. Each of those also has the option of a 2-part extension piece as well, putting 2 tiles together to make one centrepiece building, a reliquary for the city, and a great big spire for the hive. In any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to, and thanks to them for sponsoring this one. In any case, I'll leave that one there for now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and if you have found the video useful, check out the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, that's linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.